Good evening and welcome to the Planning Commissioner Training sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning, the Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, and Salisbury University's Urban Regional Land Planning Program. And I want to thank everyone online and people in the audience. This is our first time doing a hybrid project presentation. So if there are problems, please make comments on those online using the question tool, and we will try to monitor those things and address those. We have an audience in front of us, and they will ask questions along the way at times in the presentation, and we will repeat those questions so that the people in the online can listen to those questions as well and see the answers from our presenters tonight. And without further ado, I am going to turn the mic over to Dr. Ali to give a welcome from Salisbury University.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to SU, and we are happy to have you today and to talk about planning. And on behalf of Salisbury University and the Urban and Regional Planning Program, I welcome all of you, and I wish you will have a very productive session tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and we are very appreciative of the hospitality of Salisbury University. We have a few people that are still trying to find parking spaces, believe it or not, in this kind of environment. One would think that we wouldn't have that. If you want to advance the slides for me. Okay, one more. Okay, again, thank you again for joining us. This is our first planner commissioner training in about 6 months. I think we did one back in February or March. We try to do these trainings about 3 times or 4 times a year. During the COVID situation, we have not been able to do as many. We had one online training 2-day program. We broke this session into 2 different days a while back, and since then we typically did these in one sittings at MACO and MML's summer conferences, as well as the Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, MPCA. I'll say that many times today. But our training is actually mandated, as you know, by the state land use article for planning commissioners and Board of Zoning Appeals members. And it's supposed to be around 6 months after you become a member, you should go through some kind of training, either locally or we try to provide these types of trainings. And this is actually a training that there are 9 other states that have a required educational training. So we try to do this again fairly often, and people that have taken this over again learn things every time new. Because of the questions that you ask, and we encourage you to ask those people online. We will have certain breaks along the way. We will indicate break, and we will see about how many questions that are online, and we will see if anyone in the audience has a question at different sections along the way. You will note in those that are online to use the question box for you to be able to enter in your question. We will then see what those questions are, and we'll try to address them before moving on to the next part of the presentations. Again, welcome. This training is required for both those counties and charter and non-charter, and for any municipality that has exercised a planning and zoning authority. Again, it's the big counties and the little counties. Everyone is kind of encouraged or required to have the Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Appeals members take the training. We have an online training program that is kind of mirrors this, and we welcome you to go to planning.maryland.gov, and you can find out more about that training. We will send out a certificate for those that take and participate and stay online. So those people online, don't think that you just start off at the beginning and then you can sign off. We will be looking at the amount of participation and the time that you're on. And if you're not on for like close to 90% of it, you will not be eligible to get a certificate through our program. So we'd hate for you to leave us early in this process. Again, hopefully this is an enjoyable learning experience. Okay, Joe, did you switch again on me? Okay, so without further ado, again, sorry about the technical difficulties. We appreciate your service to your community. So first of all, thank you for that service, and we appreciate you coming tonight or online. Tonight's speakers are Joe Griffiths. He is with, you could see that, Joe, off to the side there, just so you know that we are learning things new. This is all new experience, so you're learning this with us. So the Joe Griffiths will be doing the foundations of planning section. Our assistant attorney general Paul Cucuzella, our counsel for the Mayor Department Planning, will be doing the law and the ethics section. Tracy Gordy, which you I'm sure know well, for the Lower Eastern Shore Regional Office, will be doing the comprehensive plan and the planning commissioner's role, and I'll finish up the process of going through some growth and tools. So we have an agenda, and I knew I forgot to do something, so forgive me those people that are online. I meant to give you an online agenda, but we will, it'll be apparent where we are all along the way. So, Joe, you're oh, okay.
You can deal with it.
I need to be able to advance.
I got it.
Okay. So, Joe, now you can Are you live?
I think it got turned off somehow.
I can hear you now. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
Joe, we can hear you now. So Joe needs to do real quick. So
Yeah,
yes. Okay, thank you. You're now back.
Sorry about that.
So Joe, I apologize for doing this to you, but we,
I need
you
to go back?
a quick backup?
All right. So
Real quick.
don't apologize to me. Let's apologize to the audience.
We can hear
All right.
you now.
Okay.
Joe, unfortunately, we'll need to remember, our mics can turn off. So
Yeah.
we are now back online here.
Okay.
Sorry for that, folks. So.
All right, so we'll stick this to the greatest hit. So Maryland is real small, but Maryland's real dense. Therefore, when you have that kind of land area and you have a lot of there's a lot of attraction for jobs, other high quality of life, you have to take planning very seriously because of that lack of size but density. Okay, so there's a long history of good planning in Maryland, going back to what the primary causes there being that attraction, the connection to the everything okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. All right. All right, so I talked about agricultural preservation. We have priority preservation areas locally designated. They're listed here where jurisdictions, counties want to preserve agricultural and forest land. There's the state's MALP easements funding. It's a state entity that puts permanent conservation easements on agricultural lands, started in 1997. And then there's a rural legacy program through the Maryland Department of Natural Resources that's actual funding for land conservation easements. All right, and as I mentioned, here is the land preservation dashboard that we developed in partnership with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And you can find everything you are interested in about land preservation in Maryland. I mean, it's one of the key things that we are well known for as a state. And so I encourage you to check that out. I think that's as far as I got, right? I talked a little bit about historic resources. That's right. The importance, the interconnection of preserving history.
One more thing. Can someone chat and confirm you can hear us fine? Or send a question? We can hear you. Thank you. Yes, good.
Okay.
Good. Thanks. I just want to double check. I got other people. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
So I was talking about MHT. They're part of the Maryland Department of Planning. They help local communities set up their own historic preservation districts or zoning. They are in charge of Section 106 reviews if you're into historic preservation. I'm not a preservationist, but Section 106 is one of the common requirements, essentially that, state and federal funding is not being used in a manner that would interfere or would lessen or damage or interfere with historic resources. All right, and then those are often ones that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a big, important threshold to get for a historic resource to get on to become eligible for federal funding and often state funding. All right, so some of the so as I mentioned earlier, they'll review as part of the 106 review, they'll review the state and federal undertakings. So again, there's not like a major infrastructure project that is going to undermine or destroy historic resource on the National Register, right? Obviously, if you're gonna say something is historically significant, needs to be preserved, you're not gonna use state or federal funding then to undermine it, all right? The strongest would be historic preservation easements in perpetuity to protect something. Again, I mentioned they'll provide technical assistance to local smaller historic preservation commissions, and then they do every 5 years create a state historic preservation plan. Here's Preserve Maryland from 2014, more recently updated than that. Okay, so we're going to continue to talk about that's kind of the history of good planning, but we're going to talk about the future of good planning. All right, so first off, we're going to ask a question for you here. What city is this? This is Chuck's favorite question. Which one is it? You have to say it loudly, so.
I'll say it here. Frederick.
Okay, they say it, of course.
I answered the question
That's
online for you.
And that's where Chuck lives. That's where Chuck lives. So
I live there.
he lives
Very
there.
proud there.
No, absolutely. but yes, it's obviously a beautiful picture, but also a wonderful achievement in that town. But it just shows the history of good planning in this state, in Frederick specifically, but and elsewhere as well. So there you go. All right. All right, but let's continue to look back at some history. So in 1916, New York City adopted the first comprehensive zoning regulations to apply citywide, which kind of became a model for zoning a lot of elsewhere. In 1922, there was the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, which was written by under the U.S. Department of Commerce. The head of Department of Commerce at that time was later President Hoover, and this was could used by states to delegate zoning authority. It was like a model ordinance to delegate zoning authority down to local communities, counties, municipalities, which is the standard practice these days. Daniel Burnham, this guy right here. If you're in planning school, you'll see his name all the time. They're always talking about Daniel Burnham. Did master planning across the state, Washington, D.C., Chicago. His famous quote is "Make no small plans." And there's Edmund Bacon, who was a vital planner and famous in Philadelphia he was a planning director there. All right, so plans for big industrial cities at the turn of the 20th century recommended extensive development and redevelopment and huge infrastructure projects. You know, back at the turn of the 20th century, that would have been, that's what people thought of it as planning. And they made a lot of successes, got a strong return on investment. When we think about history planning, a lot of people still think about that. But in the mid 20th century, we'll talk a little bit more about this. In the name of urban renewal following World War II, there was a lot of some big plans resulted in widespread destruction of existing communities, displacement, and it's kind of, if you think of planning had its modernism phase where it thought it could do whatever it wanted to. It was like we use the best science, the best planning, we can really push this, but then you eventually run into the human factor and you realize, there are communities there, and so it kind of has come back a little bit since then. But we're gonna talk about that, and then communities change, and with them, planning changes. All right, so the Chicago Plan Commission was created in 1909 to implement the Plan of Chicago, something that Burnham was heavily involved in. Yeah, it's often called the Burnham Plan, and this was very widely popular at the time. From 1912 to 1931, Chicagoans approved 86 plan-related bond issues covering some 17 different projects. All right. And as I mentioned, though, the history of planning is not one of uncheckered progress. Following World War II, planners and civic leaders initiated what I described earlier as urban renewal, which often aimed to clear and redevelop slums. At least that's what the planners, the experts thought would describe them as. They wanted new highways, they wanted new economic development projects. But these were often very vibrant communities, had strong cultural connections, and they would just displace the people with little concern for what those folks were what they saw in their community, what they would like to see. So this is Jane Jacobs. I'm sure many of you probably heard about Jane Jacobs. Her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is basically #1 essential reading for planners. And I mean, she wasn't a planner herself. But when Robert Moses, who also very big, important planner in New York, also had a lot of great successes. Engineer, planner, whatever. Engineer. I mean, he had a lot of great successes, but as well, he was trying to run Fifth Avenue through, I can't remember the name of the park, but it was right near her neighborhood. And she fought him, and she won. And she's known for the idea of eyes on the street. This idea that density is good, that the more people in a community, more people on the street, that adds vitality, safety, and natural surveillance. And essentially, so I was talking earlier about how planning had its push towards modernism, where it's could be all scientific, technical. I'm sorry, that was just me. But it kind of missed that finer grained, organic human component, right? I'm not saying Jane Jacobs was the only person to push back, but that was kind of what that exemplifies. It's like, all right, it's not all about large infrastructure projects. It's not all about these grand plans. Those they have their parts, but there's also the people factor that, so kind of like postmodernism type approach to it. All right, so catch up here a little bit on my notes. So why do we plan? All right, so first and foremost is so that we can guide sustainable and efficient use of our land. It also helps us figure out, how much public infrastructure we need, water and sewer, roads, elsewhere schools, but also where we need it to support our population. And it helps us protect sensitive areas, wetlands, floodplains, forests. It's also extremely interdisciplinary. When I tell my friends that I'm a planner, they all ask me if I can like fix their roads or fix the potholes. Like that's the first response. But planning is extremely interdisciplinary. Paul may disagree with me, but I'd like to say that there's many different areas in planning as there are in law. And you really, I mean, you could be a generalist planner focusing on all sorts of stuff, but you can be very specific. And I will say one thing I do not do is fix potholes. But a lot of people just kind of think of that. How are we doing?
Oh, question is, I just have to somebody took a photos. We will be providing you the PowerPoint PDF. So you don't have to take photos or snapshots or any type of thing on the screen. So I'm answering that question now. We will provide you a PDF of tonight's presentation.
Okay, absolutely. All right, so I know because I didn't have my microphone at the beginning, I got to move kind of fast here. But so planning really, you look at the questions, it like does it. All right. So yeah, planning, you have to understand, learn. A lot of it's about listening, right? Engaging. It's about people, but it's also about the physical environment. You need to know all of those. All right. So I do want, so the role of planning, not just with urban renewal. Obviously, urban renewal is a part of it, but the role of planning has always been a positive force in America, and I think it's something that planners need to recognize. Right, going back even further than urban renewal and with the support of New Deal policies, planners contributed to racial segregation and social injustice. The Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, created red line maps, primarily in the 30s, but they were continued to use after that. This one is of Baltimore, maps of major American cities. Yeah, so the areas shown in red were predominantly African-American neighborhoods, and when they were redlined like this, they were labeled hazardous, and therefore mortgage lenders and appraisers denied services, loans, and other capital investment in these areas. The New Deal's Federal Housing Administration, FHA, denied minority household access to the federally backed mortgages that were created as part of the National Housing Act of 1934 in response to the Great Depression. Things like, funding coming from the GI Bill used to finance mortgages, helping mortgages, that was often denied to families of color. And if you compare this 1937 map, right, which is an intentional map of federal and local policy to deny, supportive funding through planning to minority communities, a lot of the poor health outcomes, outcomes in Baltimore will line up very closely with this. It's shockingly, it aligns very closely. So this is intentional federal and local policy that led to, the current existing wealth gap in inequity. So this is intentional planning for inequity, right? But it's not just red line maps. It's not just federal programs, right? There's restrictive covenants. There's exclusive zoning where you have large lot sizes, minimum lot coverages, only single family detached, that exacerbated, de facto segregation when, legal segregation was, being taken down. Let's see. Also, budgets definitely represent priorities, and capital budgets, other budgets throughout the history of America have demonstrated that they are more willing to spend in wealthier neighborhoods. But actually, there's much, there is opportunities for planning for equity. Baltimore City and Howard County have planning academies that actively engage with a diverse community and teach planning to the citizens, help them become more engaged. You can use equity lenses, right? When we have a large development project, we're always going to consider what its impact is on transportation, water, and sewer. You can consider what its impact on equity, and then specifically focusing capital investment intentionally in areas, perhaps, areas here where it was specifically not focused in the past. So intentional policies in the past take an intentional response today. And planners in many communities don't have a good reputation, and well deserved. Sorry, break for questions. And I'm way behind.
What is capital disinvestment?
Capital disinvestment?
Yes.
Disinvestment would be where you were investing at one point and then you decided to disinvest your capital. I mean, you think of capital as like when you're spending it on things you build, developing, the hard stuff. But
I think I would say it's the absence of investment.
Okay.
In an area.
Absolutely, yeah. And as I was saying earlier, we have a long history of investing, putting our capital investments in wealthier neighborhoods.
I don't see any other questions online right now. Any questions in the audience? Hearing none?
All right.
Go.
All right. All right, Maryland, I mentioned earlier that Standard Zoning Enabling Act of 1922. So Maryland does delegate planning and zoning to local jurisdictions. Paul's going to tell you all about this through the land use article. There's other planning. Yes.
What does the comparative map of Baltimore look like today? How do you know if it's not still occurring? There's a question back about that.
Well, I mean, we don't have a red line map like that today. I mean, thankfully that we don't have that anymore. But if you were to compare that to, say, poor, economic outcomes, all the social, indicators of social problems, right? Poor health outcomes, high asthma, low income, disinvestment, blight, vacancies. It's going to line up with those areas. So you could make maps that show those areas that have those problems today, and it's going to look very close. In many respects, it's going to look close to that, and that's a result in many respects of that long history of disinvestment. Again, there aren't red line maps today, but you could look at other maps that would reflect it. All right. So land use article, this is where you'll find the requirements of local jurisdictions for planning, or jurisdictions in Maryland, but also the Maryland Department of Planning. It's where you'll find most of the planning statutes in Maryland. We have Division I for most of the state, municipalities, commission counties, and other counties. And then Division II is specific for Montgomery and Prince George's counties. Oh, there's a map. Charter or code counties. Charter or code counties have had more delegated to them. And then there's non-charter counties. And municipalities are very similar to non-charter counties. Non-charter counties have a commission form of government. So if you have county commissioners, that's going to be a non-charter county. If you have a county council, it's going to be a charter or code county. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some big U.S. planning milestones. Euclid versus Ambler Realty, one of the biggest cases that Paul's going to tell you about, basically standardized zoning and made it acceptable use of the police power, which Paul will also tell you all about. Here's some Maryland's planning milestones. First state, right, Chuck? State Planning Commission, 1933. Yep. The Maryland State Department of Planning, where Keith, Tracy, and I work, 1959. Various acts, start seeing the Smart Growth Acts here in the 90s. This is a big one, established priority funding areas, which we'll tell you more about here, 1997. And then the Sustainable Communities Act, which consolidated a lot of mostly capital investment. We were talking about capital investment earlier, but capital investment grants into kind of a space based into targeted areas and to consolidate into one program. That's run through the Department of Housing and Community Development, but Maryland Department of Planning works with them very closely on that. So priority funding areas, mentioned that earlier. The idea is to make most efficient use of taxpayer dollars, right? We talked about the density in Maryland, right? We want to focus that density. If you were, there's a lot of PFAs right across, if you look at along 95, you see a lot of PFAs, but there's a lot of PFAs on the Eastern Shore as well. The idea is we want local community to say this is where we want to grow. We're going to do the planning we need to demonstrate that we want to grow there. We're going to focus our infrastructure there. We're going to make it dense enough with our zoning, or dense to a certain threshold with our zoning, and we're going to say in our plans we want to grow there. The state will agree with them, and then the state agrees that that's where we're going to invest state growth-related infrastructure. That's a way to focus infrastructure on roads, focus infrastructure on water and sewer, because a lot of those things don't get built without state funding. So if the state agrees with locals that we want you to focus here with this density here, right? Remember I said, we're gonna talk a lot more about density, but Jane Jacobs said density was good, and most planners would say density is good. It's efficient. It also preserves open space and preserves land, and it creates more economic viability. So priority funding areas are one way to do that, very unique in Maryland. These are the main things you have to have: existing or planned water sewer service, all right? Average residential density of 3.5 units per acre, that's in zoning, all right? So, but also can be zoned for commercial or employment use. But we want that density to a certain amount. It can go above that, but it needs to have that at least, and it needs to be in the growth area for a community. So we work a lot on PFAs. We can answer a lot of questions about PFAs. Here's an example of percent residential parcels and acres by PFA for those years, right? So you'll see PFA's orange, right? Yeah, a lot more parcels inside PFA, but a lot more acres outside of PFA, right? So that gets back to that density thing, right? 3.5 dwelling units per acre. You can fit a lot more of them in there in those PFAs, right? But you want the parcels outside of PFAs and intersects to be larger, because those are the areas you want to preserve. They're farms, right? But they're also areas that are not going to be having growth-related funding spent towards them, right? We're going to have not major highways going outside of PFAs to these larger parcels. We're not going to be sending water and sewer infrastructure to these larger parcels, because it's an inefficient use of taxpayer dollars. It'll also make those areas more likely to densify themselves, right? And while density is good in some areas, you don't want it elsewhere. You want to preserve. We talked a lot about land preservation earlier. All right. So these are the trends in Maryland. I think I'm getting close to done. 600,000 new jobs by 2040. Movement of jobs outside urban communities contributes to decline of established cities and towns. And who knows how this is going to change with the rise of telework, right? I think this is still an area that we're all trying to figure out, right? In many respects, it's good. There's less people on the roads, less vehicle miles traveled, but what does it mean for where people can and want to live when they don't have to commute anymore? Is that a good or bad thing? I think these are all areas still to be figured out when it comes to planning. All right. I'm going to just kind of skim over this because I know I'm way over my time. Here's some numbers up there. We'll send these all to you.
We'll see these in the questions though.
So you got to study them. All right. All right. So it gives you a sense, like heavy growth here. I mean, look at all the.
Don't worry, we'll answer the question later on.
Okay. All right. So the review. All right. So true or false? Maryland is the 5th most densely populated state.
True.
It's true. Where's the answer?
True.
That is true.
I'll tell you the answer.
It's hard. It's probably hard to remember the exact rank it is. Okay, how many of these? Because we kind of skipped over that. They do remember that because I talked about that one.
Go with D.
I used to be a teacher, and we were taught make sure you avoid doing that. It's too easy to fall into that trap. And students figure it out. Why do we plan? All the above. Yes, land use, infrastructure, natural resources, and definitely to foster economic development.
Online's getting it.
All right. Okay. Where do Maryland jurisdictions get their planning authority? All right, we don't have all the above here, so. Correct.
C.
The land use article. Absolutely. Yeah. Priority funding areas.
People online don't have to answer if you don't want to, but we appreciate you putting that in.
Yes, make most efficient use of taxpayer dollars. They are definitely inside growth areas. They're drawn locally. The state concurs with it. They are drawn locally. They're determined locally, and they do not only include municipalities. They're definitely counties have their own PFAs. All right.
The question is online. Are there any questions that you have that need to be answered while you are writing them down? We are switching over from Joe to Paul. Paul will be doing the next section.
Yeah, turn it on like I didn't do.
On now? Okay.
Okay. Do people see me?
No.
And for those online, please let me know if there's a problem you can't hear us. Who establishes PFAs? The answer to that is it's a local designation. It's by the jurisdiction that has planning and zoning authority. So it could be a municipality or it could be a county. So either one, but the county does not determine a local municipal PFA designation. Is there a site? The Maryland Department of Planning, the question is there a map of this? Maryland Department of Planning has on its website an interactive map that shows, I'll pick it up on your mic over this, don't go far away. You're good. The Maryland Department of Planning has a website that has an interactive map for PFA. So if you Googled Maryland PFA map, it will likely come up. And local governments will submit their updated PFA maps to us. We will review them in accordance with the PFA law, and then we will concur or we may comment. And if we comment, it means that the property that they've identified does not meet all of the state requirements per the PFA law. And that information is conveyed to the state agencies that may fund projects. So if a project is in an area that is in a PFA comment, the state agency may say, well, I have limited resources, so since your project doesn't fully comply with the PFA law, I'm going to go and do this one first, come back to us when you comply, and we'll be able to address your inquiries. So it's information to the state agencies, and they typically consider a PFA comment as an area that doesn't qualify right now, and therefore will go and use their limited resources elsewhere. And thank you very much. And now, Paul, you are able to move forward.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can people online hear me? Someone give a thumbs up, thumbs up. Okay, good.
On Paul, can you hear him?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Good evening. My name is Paul Cucuzella. I'm with the Office of the Attorney General. I'm counsel to the Maryland Department of Planning. I'm going to give you a really high-level overview on some legal issues related to land use and planning that I always say in this course, as members of Planning Commission or members of Boards of Appeals, these are legal issues that you should have in the back, sort of in the back of your head as issues. So if you actually stumble upon them, you may not know the answer to the question, but you'll know, wait a minute, I heard about this in that Planning Commissioner course. I think maybe I should go ask my county attorney or my municipal attorney or office of law or whatever the case may be for more specific guidance. So this is really meant just to get you to be sort of what we call issue spotters. So you recognize when there may be an issue and when you've got to go seek some legal guidance. So we're gonna touch upon the authority for planning and zoning. Then we're going to move to really the most important part of this presentation is constitutional considerations, and most in particular aspects of Fifth Amendment takings. These are matters that you know in the local land use planning, zoning, permitting process. You have to have some sort of understanding of what a taking is for constitutional purposes. Equal protection we'll talk about. Then we'll get into some law specific to Maryland, special exceptions, variances, and then we'll talk about the Board of Appeals, what that looks like, and then we'll quickly go through government ethics. Okay, so the power, what the Constitution says is that all powers not reserved to the federal government or held by the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. And one of these powers is what is known as the police power. the federal government doesn't have the police power. The police power lies with the states. And what that means is the government's authority to regulate on issues dealing with public health, safety, and welfare. So the police power is held by the state, and in many instances, in most states, it's delegated to local governments. So what does that mean for land use and planning? So the Euclid case, where it was where the Supreme Court first recognized the authority of zoning as an exercise of the police power. So what the court said in Euclid was that essentially, as human interactions and growth and development gets more and more complex, there is a government interest in sort of putting parameters on growth, establishing what areas in a community are ripe for residential, what areas of community are best for business practices or industry, and keeping, say, dangerous uses away from residential areas. All of this, the court reasoned was giving the government the authority to zone was a valid exercise of the police power because it advanced health, safety, and welfare of communities. And this is when the court first recognized zoning as an exercise of the police power, which meant that any entity that has the police power can now zone, which means all the states, which also means that power is delegated to local governments. It's a valid exercise of the police power. It's not unconstitutional, because at the time there was some thought as though zoning was in violation of the Fifth Amendment. In other words, it was a taking. Euclid was in Ohio, village of Euclid, Ohio, right? Euclid was in Ohio. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So the argument in Euclid against using the police power as looking to health, safety, and welfare for zoning purposes was essentially that if you zone something, you're taking away some of the bundle of rights of a property owner, right? So if something's zoned residential and I own that property, I can't build a factory on that property. So the argument was that exercise of zoning was a taking of a property interest. And there were those that thought that was a violation of the Fifth Amendment. Court said otherwise. But there are instances where the exercise of government authority over private property rights does amount to a taking. And we're going to go through the three most common instances where you see this applied. So first is eminent domain, second is regulatory takings, and the third which isn't actually a taking but does have Fifth Amendment constitutional considerations, is with respect to exactions. So we'll go through these one at a time. So eminent domain. So what the Fifth Amendment says is private property cannot be taken without just compensation. So the government can take your property, it just has to compensate for you for it, right? So the most direct form of a taking under the Fifth Amendment is the exercise of eminent domain, and that's where the government comes in, seizes private property, right, for some public purpose. They're going to build a bridge, we're going to build a hospital, we're going to build a school, we're going to build a road, some big public project. At least historically, that's what eminent domain was used for. So public works, roads, schools, government buildings. If the government wants your property for those purposes, it's got to compensate you for it. And if that happens, it's not a violation of the Fifth Amendment. It's a valid exercise of the power of eminent domain. But this has evolved over the years in terms of what is considered a valid exercise of the power of eminent domain. So the first big constitutional leap in terms of what the Supreme Court said is a valid exercise of eminent domain came in this case, Berman versus Parker. In that case, there was a blighted community in Washington, D.C., where it was infested with crime and drugs and a whole host of economic ills and societal ills within this particular area that DC was interested in revitalizing. And so there was a redevelopment plan which involved seizing ownership of a bunch of private property in this area and turning it over to a developer to revitalize the area. And this action was challenged because it wasn't a big public works project. They weren't building a highway, they weren't building a bridge, they weren't building a school. It was essentially a land grab to give to private developers so they could redevelop and make some money, right? The Supreme Court said that this was a valid public purpose. And the rationale was that doing this would promote public safety, public health, morality, peace and quiet, law and order. In other words, the redevelopment project, one of its principal purposes was to remove the dangers and the ills of this blighted area. And the Supreme Court agreed and said that that is a valid exercise of the power of eminent domain. The next big leap forward in the law of eminent domain occurred in Kelo versus City of New London. This wasn't that long ago, but it's getting a little bit in the rearview mirror now. Most of you may recall this case. This was very controversial at the time. This was different from the Berman case in that it had a similar purpose, in that the town of New Haven, Connecticut wanted to seize a bunch of private property to hand it over for redevelopment purposes. But it wasn't a blighted community. It was a working class community, bunch of single family homes. It was probably underutilized. It wasn't the wealthiest community in the world. There were some vacancies, but it wasn't by any stretch blighted. But the city saw, because of the location of the community, that it had a lot of potential for redevelopment that would benefit the city more broadly, would increase the tax base, and so the city went in. They exercised their power of eminent domain. They collected up all this property for purposes of handing it over to private development, and that action was challenged as being unconstitutional, not a valid exercise of the power of eminent domain. The city said that the public purpose was economic development. And the city won on that argument for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled in favor of the city of New London, Connecticut, and ruled that economic development and increasing the tax base was a valid public purpose through which a town or a municipality or local government could exercise the power of eminent domain. Any questions about eminent domain?
I just want to check your picture. Give me your one. Where's your
package? Give me that one. We want to make sure that these stay good, so.
Okay. Question? Yeah. So not so much a question, but a comment is that the Kelo decision I think the Kelo decision touches a lot of people the wrong way. I think Because it is broad. It does give governments a lot of authority to seize property. Just think about what economic development could mean. What I'll say is that a lot of state legislatures around the country, municipalities around the country have passed legislation in the wake of Kelo to put guardrails on it, which they have the right to do, right? So if the local law says this isn't economic development in these ways, isn't a valid exercise of the police power, the local law can say that, regardless of what Kelo said, because Kelo is like the Supreme Court saying you can do this, you don't have to, but you can. It's valid under the Constitution. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
We have an online question that says, are courts required to weigh the necessity of the governmental regulation against the private interest of the landowner?
Wow, that's actually a good question. It's sort of in the weeds of eminent domain law. And I can't say.
Just repeat that again a little bit so that they can hear. You heard it, but I'm not sure it went online. Are the courts required to weigh the necessity of the governmental regulations against the private interest of the landowner?
I don't know if I can answer that question fully. I think that the courts look principally at what is the government purpose and whether it's a valid government purpose. When looking at issues of eminent domain, whether the interest, the use given by the private property owner of the property is weighed, may inform whether the government purpose intended is a valid government purpose, but the courts are going to look principally at what is the government purpose.
And I'm a lawyer, I'm just a long-time planner. I will say this is why local governments, planning departments prepare redevelopment plans. They plan and they do an effort to document those concerns and to make sure that there's a reason for a particular property being taken, that there's a justification when and if the local government pursues that, and the courts might take that into consideration. The next question is, are there any cases where the eminent domain was stopped due to economic development purposes? Are there any cases where the eminent domain was stopped due to economic development purposes?
I'm not quite sure.
I guess the answer is not really, because court case allowed for eminent domain. The Kelo case allowed for eminent domain to be used for economic development purposes. Next question is, especially in the case of private developers that get rich. Again, as I understand it, in the Kelo case, they actually were tearing down a not so blighted area, and they were actually took that, and lo and behold, they actually didn't go and actually do all of the wonderful economic development things. It was kind of a bust, as I understand, in terms of an economic development effort there. So there's no guarantee that an eminent domain is going to turn out to be richer than it was before from a property value perspective.
Yes.
I'm still on that Kelo. Okay, so you could have a neighborhood that, according to the local code, is doing everything right. Everybody is code compliant, like good. It's just 50 or 60 years old instead of brand new. What kind of assurances do the people who own private property have in that regard?
So the question is, what sort of assurances do private property owners have that the government's not going to swoop in and take their property for economic development purposes if, you know, let's say it's nice property but not great property, if I characterize your question correctly. So so your question is really more political than legal. The Supreme Court has said that economic development is a valid public purpose for the exercise of eminent domain. Whether an individual local community exercises that power in an instance like you're describing is a political question, right? And I think I could fairly characterize what's happened in the wake of Kelo is there's not a lot of appetite for using eminent domain for purposes that you're describing.
So there's probably going to be more kickback as far as making the provisions to guard against that.
Yes, there certainly in the years immediately following Kelo, there was a lot of legislation around the country that put the guardrails on what eminent domain could be used for, and that's a political reaction to a development in constitutional jurisprudence, which you see all the time. The Supreme Court's just saying you can do it, you don't have to, but you can. Yeah.
How is compensation to seized property determined?
By the courts, ultimately by the courts. The fair value is when eminent domain is used, a property owner is supposed to be given fair value for the property, and ultimately the courts determine what that is.
Has there been an instance where the town has taken state land? So it's
No, yeah, in Maryland, that's no. No, no, the short answer to that is no.
Okay, let's go forward.
Okay, okay, let's talk about regulatory taking. So we talk, so eminent domain is like the physical seizure of property. I'm taking your property, right? A regulatory taking is when there is an impact of law or regulation that has an impact on those bundle of rights in a way that that diminishes your property interest. And so if the effect of a law or regulation is to take away some of your property rights, then at some point that becomes a taking. This was first recognized in a Pennsylvania case back in 1922 by the Supreme Court. Real quick on that case, what happened there is there was a piece of property for which a coal mining company had purchased the subsurface rights of the property, only the subsurface rights. So they owned the mineral interest in the property, and the ground was still owned by some guy who owned a house, right? And after this mining company had purchased these mineral rights, some years later, the state legislature passed a law that said that minerals could not be extracted if the effect of that extraction might cause a subsidence of a residential structure. What does that mean? So if this guy that owned these mineral rights took out the coal from under this property, it would affect this house on this property, and so they sued, saying that this was a taking of their property interest. And what the court said in very interesting language, said that while private property may be regulated to a certain extent, if regulations go too far, it may be recognized as a taking. And these two words, in this case from 1922, too far, the court has been grappling with those two words ever since 1922 as to what that means. In this particular instance, it was determined that the taking of these the mining company, their interest in the property, their entire interest in the property was the mineral rights, and the effect of this law was to basically obliterate those mineral rights. And so that was a total taking. Their entire interest in that property was taken. So the court said, yes, that was a taking as in that particular instance. The next big case in this regulatory taking realm was Lucas versus South Carolina Coastal Commission. In this case, Mr. Lucas owned 3 parcels of property adjoining one another in Isle of Palm, South Carolina, right on the beach. And at the time he purchased the property, he had residential development rights in all three parcels. He could build a residence on all 3 of these parcels. He built this ugly thing on the middle parcel, and then his intent was to save the two parcels on either side of his house for his children. Some years later, after he had purchased this property, South Carolina passed a law that ended up in a regulation enforced by the South Carolina Coastal Commission that effectively moved the development boundary back away from the shore. So the effect of the regulation was that he could no longer build on either of these 2 properties because the line was behind his property on the other, it was landward of his property. So what the court said in this, and he sued, he was like, oh, this is no fair. They're taking my property rights. This is unconstitutional, 5th Amendment taking. And the Supreme Court agreed, and in doing so, created what has become known as a categorical rule in takings cases, where if there's a total taking, in other words, the effect of the law or the regulation is to basically remove my entire bundle of rights. And his bundle of rights here was the right to use the property for residential purposes. It obliterated those rights and therefore was a total taking. And the court ruled in his favor. So that was an interesting case. But what about partial takings? So I think if we go back to remember I said if government regulation goes too far, well, this was too far. It was a total taking. But in this case, Penn Central versus New York City. So everybody familiar with Grand Central in New York City, Grand Central Terminal. So this involved Grand Central Terminal. Some years prior to this case, New York City had instituted a historic preservation ordinance, and under the historic preservation ordinance, there was a historic preservation commission, and if you had property that was listed on the National Register, or was otherwise designated by New York City as historic property, you couldn't do anything to that structure without the approval of the Historic Preservation Commission. We've all got them here, same sort of deal. So what happened is, long after the Historic Preservation Commission had been set up, investors came in, Penn Central came in and purchased Grand Central Terminal. As is, knowing that it was a listed property protected under the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and they went to the Historic Preservation Commission with an idea of building a 50-story office tower on top of Grand Central Terminal. And they said, well, our rights go to the property owner says our rights in this property go to the, they go to the sky, right? So the Historic Preservation Ordinance shot it down, said no, we won't permit. This is too intrusive on the historic structure. We won't permit you to build a 50-story office tower on top of it. Case went all the way up to the Supreme Court as to whether the refusal to permit them to add this 50-story tower on top was a taking. And the court said, no, it was not a taking. And what the court looked at were, what were the owners, first, what was their investment-backed expectations? So when the owner of the property purchased the Grand Central Terminal, the owner knew about the restrictions. So, you know, they knew what they were getting, right? So their investment expectations were that they could have a railroad terminal, essentially. And of course, the court also said, when doing this analysis of whether there has been a taking, they look at the whole of the property and whether there's some economic viable use of the property, instead of segmenting the property into pieces. And what the property owner wanted the court to do here was basically say, you've taken all of my air rights to this property. I have rights from the ground to the heavens in this property, and you basically cut those rights off at the roof of Grand Central Terminal. The court said, no, we don't look at it that way. We look at the property as a whole. So in that instance, there was no taking. In Sierra Tahoe case, which had to do with a moratorium on development while the town of Tahoe, California, was undertaking a comprehensive rezoning process, the court said that the development moratorium during that, it was like a 2-year process, the development moratorium during that 2-year process was not a taking. And in that case, it had some interesting language where the court said they refused to adopt sort of like a per se rule on what amounts to a partial taking. So the bottom line here is that total takings are easy to see and are definitely bad. What amounts to a partial taking, in other words, if a regulation has some effect on my property interest, but not a total effect on my property interest, the courts generally permit such things, but there's a line somewhere that the Supreme Court hasn't tackled yet. There's some line to be crossed where as you get closer and closer to the effect of a law or regulation taking away effectively all of my property interests, that's going to amount to a take.
So the
questions about regulatory takings.
I got a mic now, so you don't have
Oh,
to
good.
mic. Yeah. So we have a question is, does regulatory taking require compensation?
No. Well, it depends. Ordinarily, the way it works.
That's a lawyer question. That's a typical lawyer. Yes. So now,
so if you go back to the Lucas case, the state bought the property from Lucas after Lucas won the lawsuit. So there was an element of compensation there, which the state turned around and developed the property anyways. But yeah, so but the remedy in a regulatory takings case is to invalidate the restriction, right? So Lucas would have been able to build a residence on the structure after he won the case. The remedy is to invalidate the effect of the ordinance, the effect that ordinance or regulation has upon the individual piece of property.
I don't see any other questions from the audience. Go ahead and go on. We got lots to go through.
Okay.
Oh, so if zoning ordinance restricts building heights, is that a partial taking?
No. Well, such things have generally been upheld as not a taking. It would be, yes, it is a partial taking because let's say you rezone and my property used to be zoned for 10-story structures, and then they go in, they do rezoning, and now it's only 5-story structures. That effect of that rezoning is to take some of my bundle of rights. I can no longer build a 10-story structure. I can only build a 5-story structure. In those instances, the courts have generally said those are not unconstitutional takings because, again, there's a valid government purpose for it, and you're not losing sort of all economic viable use of the property, which is sort of some of the language the courts have used in describing these things.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so that's regulatory takings. So that's a big thing to sort of just be looking out for if you're planning commission, Board of Appeals, you're looking at these issues, what effect an ordinance or regulation has on an individual piece of property, or if you're crafting regulations, you know, what effect a regulation may have on property interest. Okay, exactions. Exactions are conditions placed on permits, right? So I'll give you a building permit in exchange for an impact fee, or you know, having to create a stream buffer on the property. Some sort of fee applied to a permit, or yeah, some positive remedy you have to provide in order to undertake your rights under the permit. At some point, these things are invalid. They go too far. And what does too far mean? The courts have developed what is known as the rational nexus and rough proportionality test. And I'll describe what that means. Two key cases that set the parameters for what is a valid and what is a valid and what is not a valid monetary exaction on a say a building permit. The first one was Nolan versus California Coastal Commission. In this case, there was a ordinance in I forget the name of the town. There's a town in California on the ocean. There was a view shed ordinance that protected the view of the ocean from a public right of way. And if you were going to do anything to obstruct the view, there were penalties to be paid effectively, the things you would have to do. So, and the purpose of the view shed ordinance obviously was to protect the view, right? So, so Nolan had vacant property on the ocean that he had every right to develop residentially. So they couldn't prohibit him from developing his property for residential purposes, because to do so would be a taking. So he got a building permit to build his residence on this property, and a condition of the building permit was that he had to deed a right of way across his property from the public road to the beach. And Mr. Nolan was very smart. He said, wait a minute. That has to do with access to the beach. That has nothing to do with view shed from the public road. He said, there's no connection here between the condition they've imposed on my permit and the purpose of the ordinance. So he went all the way to the Supreme Court with it. The court agreed. The court said there has to be a rational nexus between the exaction required by the permit and the government purpose that's served by essentially the ordinance that underlies the exaction. And in this case, there was no rational nexus. They could have maybe limited the breadth and scope of what he could build, so as not obstructing the view shed. You know, they could have mandated that that the structure would only be constructed in a way that blends well with the natural environment, in a way that's visually appealing from the roadway. That might be rational, but deeding the access right of way had nothing to do with the view shed. So that's the rational nexus test. The next test was the rough proportionality test in the case of Dolan versus City of Teagard, and this was in Oregon. In that case, there was an owner of a bike shop and the bike shop was a little bit outside of this town of Teagard. And this guy, the property sort of bounded on this stream, and there was a stream buffer. And so the guy that owned this bike shop, his business was doing well. He wanted to expand the bike shop, and he wanted to expand the parking to the bike shop, which means more impervious surface. So there was an ordinance having to do with impervious surface and impacts, and putting conditions on permits to mitigate for new impervious surface. And so this guy got his permit to expand his business and to pave the parking lot, which included some stormwater mitigation. But the court also, it's not the court, the town also put a condition on the permit that he had to construct bike paths into the town, and he had to dedicate a greenway easement on a rather large piece of property unconnected to his property. And court looked at it with respect to the bike path. What do you think it said? The court said with respect to the bike path, the condition. Why? Why else? Yeah, no rational nexus. There's no rational nexus between the purpose of the ordinance, which was to mitigate for impervious surfaces, and constructing a bike path. Like, there's no rational nexus there. So the court struck down the bike path. With respect to the greenway, which was going to be very expensive, and which would have way more accounted for any sort of impacts new impervious surfaces would have caused. Plus, there was also on-site stormwater mitigation that was going to be done. The court said there was no rough proportionality between the scope of the condition and the impact that was going to be caused. It was way out of proportion. It was too much, effectively. So taking these two cases taken together, when looking at exactions and impact fees and requirements, mitigation requirements, there has to be a rational nexus between what's required and the purpose of the requirement, and it has to be proportional to the adverse effect that the development will have. We won't go into that too much. Any questions about exactions?
Guess I don't see any questions yet. We had one that was just a follow-up and said that a 10-story building would impact the right-of-way of the neighborhood. However, that was dealing with the question about reducing the height to be a taking.
Okay.
No questions from the audience, the virtual audience.
Okay.
Moving on.
All right. So that's the Fifth Amendment considerations, takings, and the like. Now we'll talk a little bit about 14th Amendment implications on zoning, planning and zoning. 14th Amendment is basically treat everyone equally, right? Equal protection of the law. The law affords everybody equal protection. So what does this mean in the zoning context? So when you're talking about equal protection, you're talking about, okay, how are we treating people or things, places, how are we treating people differently? What sort of discriminators are we using, and are those discriminators constitutional or are they unconstitutional? So discriminators in the law are generally permitted if they are rational, non-arbitrary, and reasonable in relation to the goals of the law or the regulation. Classifications are discriminators, classifications are subject to strict scrutiny and likely not permitted if they are based upon suspect classifications, race, national origin, ancestry, religion, those sorts of things, or a fundamental right. So basically, drawing distinctions in the law, using discriminators in the law is okay if they're rationally related to some legitimate government purpose, so long as they're not based on these things. Once you start basing your discriminating factors on things like race and religion, well, then you've got equal protection problems. So how does this relate to zoning? Zoning is inherently discriminatory, right? We are saying you can do one thing on this side of the street that you can't do on the other side of the street. That's discriminating. You're discriminating against one side of the street versus the other. However, as long as you don't do it in a way that touches upon a classification. So you can't say, you know, only Catholics on this side of the street and Protestants on the other side of the street. If you do that, well, then you got yourself a problem. That's going to be a violation of the 14th Amendment. So keep your discriminators based on things that are class neutral, such as use, size, bulk, presence, those sorts of things. I always use in this part of the discussion, I always use an example. So strict scrutiny. So a discriminator based on religion, for instance, is generally unconstitutional. It will only be constitutional if it survives strict scrutiny. It means it has to be narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling government interest. And the example I use in the zoning context is, let's say you transport the United States Constitution to Northern Ireland in 1984 in Belfast, and you have a wall between the Protestants and the Catholics in Belfast. And you're saying only Protestants can live on this side of the wall and Catholics can live on the other side. I would argue in that instance in 1984 in Belfast, doing that sort of thing may have been a compelling government interest, and it may have been narrowly tailored to serve that compelling government interest because you had warring factions and civil unrest and strife and disturbance. But short of that extreme example, equal protection says don't do such things. Any questions about equal protection? Real simple.
No questions online.
Okay. All right, let's talk about Maryland. All right, planning and zoning in Maryland. Going back to the beginning of the discussion, the state has delegated planning and zoning authority to local jurisdictions. You can find a law on this with respect to charter counties in the local government article. For non-charter counties and municipalities, the law related to planning and zoning is in Division 1 of the land use article for the most part. And for Montgomery and PG County, we look to Division 2 of the land use article. Any Montgomery County, PG County people here today? Good. All right, because it's really confusing down there. Okay, there we are. We've already seen that. Okay. Okay, so the state delegation of planning and zoning authority comes with certain caveats. Not a lot, but there are a few important ones. So if your local government is going to exercise planning and zoning, it must adopt a comprehensive plan. There has to be a comprehensive plan. That plan has to implement the state's 12 planning visions, which can be found in the land use article. How that gets enforced is questionable. And most importantly, or perhaps most interesting, the local implementation of the comprehensive plan, in other words, zoning ordinances, building ordinances, subdivision ordinances, all of that has to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So you can't like do a comprehensive plan and then throw it out the window and then adopt a zoning ordinance that's completely contrary to the comprehensive plan. That would be a violation of the land use article. Okay, so so zoning, the basics of zoning in Maryland, it's by ordinance. It's exercise of police power, so it has to promote health, safety, welfare. It regulates density, bulk, height, uses. Zoning ordinances should provide for uses by right. In other words, in this zone is permitted X, Y, and Z, and can provide and should provide for conditional uses should circumstances arise that would warrant those uses, and that's known as special exceptions. And we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. Comprehensive zoning in Maryland. So comprehensive zoning is a legislative act where you zone a large area. It doesn't have to be necessarily the entire area, say, of a county. It could be like in Anne Arundel County, it could be South County that goes through comprehensive zoning, but regardless, it's a large area. It implements the comprehensive plan. In other words, it again has to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So usually comprehensive zoning comes after comprehensive planning. Covers a large area, product of careful study. Directs and controls uses of land in substantially all of a jurisdiction. This is a legislative act, as I said. Spot zoning is not permitted in comprehensive zoning. Could take me a while to really explain what spot zoning is, but basically is what it sounds like when you've got an isolated block of one use within a larger area of use that's different. That could be illegal spot zoning. Okay, so comprehensive zoning is zoning the whole area. Piecemeal zoning is rezoning individual parcels after comprehensive zoning. This is not a legislative act. This is normally done by the Board of Appeals, approves instances of comprehensive, piecemeal zoning. So it's what's known as a quasi-judicial act because it's fact specific. It's specific to an individual parcel, and it doesn't involve all those sort of legislative considerations that are much broader in scope. Yeah.
Sorry. In municipalities, though, the town councils will do a request for rezoning in a piecemeal manner.
Yeah.
So just, always,
regardless of how it's done.
right.
Regardless of how it's done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of jurisdictions don't have Board of Appeals and actually do piecemeal zoning. They actually do it as a legislative body, but as if under quasi-judicial.
Yeah.
So I just wanted you to
Yeah.
clarify it or
Charter counties is where you'll find this being done at the Board of Appeals. So there's only two ways in Maryland to do piecemeal rezoning. And that's one is if there was a mistake in the original zone. So the intent was for the line to go here, but when the map was drawn, the line went here, and there was a mistake. And that has to be proven in some sort of proceeding as established by the local government, or upon evidence of substantial change in the character of a neighborhood since the original zoning or comprehensive rezoning. Don't want to get into a big fuss about what this means, but very difficult to prove. Normally would have to come long after the zoning process has occurred in order for there to be enough time for some sort of substantial change in the area that would warrant the rezoning. So in Maryland, it's called the change mistake rule. So the so what here is when you do comprehensive zoning, it should be careful, thoughtful study because it's very difficult to change it once it's been done. To change zoning after comprehensive zoning, basically you've got to go back and do comprehensive zoning again. Contract zoning is illegal. This is like, I purchase my zoning. I give a contribution to the city to build a park in order for my property to be zoned commercial in what is otherwise a residential area. And I get an agreement from the jurisdiction that my property will be zoned a certain way. That is backhanded dealing, not in keeping with open government and good government. And so that is illegal. Make sure you don't do any contract zoning. Okay, special exceptions. I talked about this quickly, but we'll touch upon it here. These are, Chuck hates the term special exception. He always says that, but
the reason is I had a alderman in Frederick that said, it's not a special exception. Everyone gets it. It's not like it's, you're restricting it.
Yeah.
In other words, if they made the conditions, it's not special to give them. And I think he implied that he likes to give out special exceptions to all these special people.
So, but the reality is we're stuck with the term because it's in the statutes and the courts use the term. But what it's also known as conditional uses. It's not a change. It's not a change to zoning. It doesn't change the underlying zoning of a parcel property. It just permits a use that isn't specifically allowed under that zoning by right, but is allowed under special circumstances. So the example that I always point to is the dentist office in a residential community. So you see these all over the place. So you have a residential community, and in the zoning ordinance, maybe it provided that by grant of a special exception, you could use your residential structure to have a dental office under if certain conditions are met in the community. And so if it's allowable, but only permitted under certain conditions, it's compatible with the neighborhood and furthers the purpose of the special use. It's not contrary to the comprehensive plan, and it has, and this is always like a head spinner, it has to have no adverse effect upon adjoining or surrounding properties unique or different from the effect if located elsewhere within the zone. So in other words, if I put the dental office, it's going to have no worse effect if I put the dental office on this block than if I put the dental office on the other block. It's going to be the same regardless. It's going to affect, regardless of which block I put it on. There's going to be a sign that says dental office. There's going to be people coming up and driving through the community, get to the dental office. So that's what that means. But as Chuck always points out, these are things that need to be anticipated in advance when you do the zoning, because they're only permitted if they were anticipated as something that could be permitted under certain circumstances. A recent, it's getting a little bit in the rear view mirror now, 2017, but this was an interesting case just to give you an idea of adverse effect and what that means, and how the courts look at this. So this was in Howard County, this Clarksville Residents Against Mortuary Defense Fund. So there was this was a predominantly Korean community in Ellicott City, where it was a residential community, but there was a provision in the zoning ordinance for that a funeral home could be permitted in this residential community. And And the zoning code stipulated that the adverse effects would be physical conditions, right? Noise, dust, fumes, odors, lighting, those sort of things. If there was an adverse effect from from a special exception, that may be a basis for challenging it. Apparently, within the culture, Koreans don't like to live near funeral homes. That's part of their culture. So they argued that the community association challenged this special exception on cultural aversion grounds. And what the court said was, while that's unfortunate, a cultural aversion isn't a physical condition, dust, noise, fumes, odor, lighting, that might permit rejecting the special exception. So they were allowed to build a funeral home, notwithstanding the cultural aversion. Any questions about special exception?
We do have a couple questions. The first question was, can a special exception be added to an amendment to a zoning designation after the fact?
Yeah, I think it probably could be, right? I mean, you could amend the zoning ordinance
Sure.
to permit, yes.
So I mean, you
Yeah.
go have a text amendment to add a conditional use after the fact.
Now, if the evidence was that a property owner went to the city council and sort of negotiated for the special exception to be instituted into the zoning ordinance, that might be a problem. But as long as it was a legitimate legislative act, yes.
Right. Another question is the workaround regarding contract zoning the establishment of a case-specific overlay zone? And my answer would generally be no. You still have to have that treat everyone the same. Can't be one uniquely for that.
Yeah, there can't be an agreement in advance between property owner or owners and the town council or what have you. It has to be a legitimate open legislative act.
Other question is, can you talk about Schultz versus Pritz, if possible?
Schultz versus Pritz.
P-R-I-T-Z.
I'm not
Don't
sure
know-
I'm familiar
don't-
with Schultz versus Pritz.
I'm not sure. We'll find out more about that and let you know later. Can the special exception be added? Oh, I answered that one already. So go ahead. I think we are up to order, right? One more. Are the prior uses automatically grandfathered if the zoning changes, or does the special exception need to be made? For example, a lawnmower repair shop that was later designated a residential zoned area.
Huh?
So I guess the issue is, at one time, it's a special exception. They removed, and they were, you can't move it. Hold on, let me
Yeah, I'm stuck.
try again. There you go. Okay. Lawnmower operation was in place at one point as a conditional use. They removed that conditional use from the zoning ordinance. The lawnmower business is still there.
Grandfathered.
It's grandfathered in that instance. Now, again, not the lawyer here. I do know that there are some instances, depending upon how you write your special exceptions, is that they are not always transferable from one owner to the next. So that in fact, and you need to make that clear in your zoning ordinances so that when you sell your property, you don't represent, oh, I had a lawnmower operation on here that was grandfathered in, and you're allowed to keep on doing it because it was a special exception that I got. Well, the new person that owns it didn't get the special exception. Typically, again, not a lawyer here. I'm just been a zoning administrator for about 20 years. We would say, you need to come back and get a special exception again because you're not you're a new owner. The conditions that they agreed to, we need to make sure. So that we always advise them that didn't transfer automatically. But again, it needs to be clear in your zoning ordinance so that there's no ambiguity. So the property owners that own the property or future owners know that anything that is conditional use should go back and get reapproved. And that's just again, zoning administrator prior experience.
Okay.
I think we are I'm sorry, I just want to make sure. Do takings concerns about abuse should apply to governmental mandated wind turbines in the place of Ocean City, for example? Do you want to even touch that?
Yeah, so so I don't know. So there's no view shed. I don't know if there's a view shed ordinance in Ocean City that protects, like, I don't, but that's way in the weeds.
Yeah, is a special law regarding one property similar to a contract zoning?
What's that?
Is a special law regarding one property similar to a contract zoning? I guess the question is, a lot of times you're not supposed to write laws for an individual person, and therefore should your regulations be one parcel?
That's called a bill of attainder. Yes, so law can't be written in a way that adversely, for the purpose, or the purpose of affecting like an individual person. That's called an unconstitutional bill of attainder.
Okay, I think you should have to go back again.
All right, variances under Maryland law. This is, sometimes people confuse special exceptions and variances. Special exceptions, you're being permitted to do something that's not otherwise, you're permitted a use that's not otherwise a use permitted by right. A variance is providing relief from some sort of restriction, given special circumstances where if the restrictions were imposed upon you, you couldn't make productive use of your property. And that would be what? A taking, right? So it's a modification of a requirement in the building code or zoning law regarding density, bulk, dimensions, area requirements. It's granted to avoid a hardship due to conditions particular to property. The applicant can't have created their own hardship, and I won't get into what all that means, but basically you can't put yourself in a bad position and then say, oh, I'm in a bad position. And it can't confer special privilege upon the property owner. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, so this diagram, you've got an existing lot with an existing residential structure and a barn, and another lot down here, and this lot owner wants to build a house on his property, but he's constrained by two different setbacks. The first is a side yard setback that prevents him from building his property too far to the right. And the second setback is from this barn on the adjacent property, which prevents him from building his structure too far to the left. So that the effect of the two setbacks is to squeeze him where he can't build a residence on his property. So he needs a variance from one of these two setbacks in order to build a residence on his property. So he's entitled to the side yard setback to move a variance to the side yard setback to move that line further to the right, so he can fit his residence in there in a way that complies with the barn setback. That make sense? You got like a befuddled look on your face.
How does the barn fit into this?
So there's a setback in the code that says you can't build on adjoining property within a certain radius of a barn. So just imagine that there's such a law, right?
It's in a regulation that he dreamed up.
Yeah.
That looks at not your property, but adjacent property to put that setback. Doesn't happen very often, but it works in a lawyer's mind.
Yeah. This could be anything. I mean, this could be a stream buffer. You can't construct too close to a stream buffer. But basically what I'm saying here, you got two competing setbacks that squeezes this guy. He can't build a home on his property because of these two competing setbacks. So he needs a variance from one of the setbacks in order to avoid a hardship. So that's the basis for the variance. So that's what I've been in. Okay, vesting, real quick in Maryland. So once, local government issues like a building permit, for instance, the recipient of that building permit doesn't vest in that building permit until they take some physical manifestation on the property of exercising their rights under that building permit. In other words, they start turning dirt, they start, surveying and putting stakes and building foundation, or whatever the case may be. And until you're vested, if there's a change in the law that might eviscerate whatever right you've been given under the building permit, you would lose that right. So once you vested in it, you keep that right. Until you're vested, you could lose it if there's some sort of change in the law that takes away that
Minimum amount of investment? I mean, pretty much anything?
So yeah, you can't like I get my permit today. I go out to the property. I don't have my financing in place. I don't have any plans, and so I take a shovel, right, and I turn one shovel of dirt and I create a little pile. That's not vesting, right? That's not enough. Where the line is, I don't know. It's got to be something substantial. It has to be something substantial.
Developers will stick signs up saying, come see. You think of a development just up the road that has had.
We all know those coming soon.
But the sign doesn't vest. The intent to build the development doesn't vest. But you will see that and they'll say, oh, but people knew
Pretty
about
much
it
start
for
on
20
the
years.
infrastructure of the property.
There has to be some substantial progress, initiation of the turning of the dirt, and one, shovelful is probably not it. Okay. All right. Questions?
No question. Oh, we do have.
We do have a question. What is MDS? I'm not sure what that
What is MDS?
Sorry, maybe you could write about what's MDS. I didn't know if that was on a slide there.
No?
Ah, the barn.
Oh, yeah. I don't worry about that.
Don't worry about that. We're going to speed up now because we're getting close
Yeah,
to.
boards of appeal, and we're getting there. Boards of appeals, okay. Boards of appeals are required in non-charter counties. If you're a non-charter county municipality, you have to have a board of appeals. They are authorized in charter counties. All charter counties have established a board of appeals. What do they look like in non-charter counties? By statute, there must be at least 3 members. The members serve for 3-year terms, and they are appointed by the local executive and confirmed by the local legislative body. In charter counties, what they look like and how they're appointed is up to local law. What do they do? In non-charter municipalities, they hear appeals where there's an error in an alleged administrative enforcement of an application of the zone, code enforcement, right? Appeal of code enforcement. They hear special exceptions and they hear variances. Okay. In charter counties, they do whatever local law says they're going to do. Things that they do in addition to all this stuff. They oftentimes they'll applications for zoning variances, administrative actions on licenses, permits, approvals, exceptions, waivers, certificates, assessment of special benefits taxes. So there's a whole host of things that Board of Appeals do in charter counties that they do not do in non-charters and municipalities. Okay. Board of Appeals proceedings must be publicly announced. They are subject to the Open Meetings Act, which means very limited use of closed sessions. Everything that the Board of Appeals does is an open session, including its deliberations. So a Board of Appeals proceeding sometimes looks like a mini court trial, just in the way it flows, but in reality, it's not. because in a court trial, the jury goes into the deliberation room and no one knows what happens in there, and that's by design. Board of Appeals deliberations are in public, in the open. Board of Appeals, they must be recorded. Witnesses give testimony under oath, and they must comply with local rules of procedures with respect to how the proceedings go. You know, how witnesses are called, who gives testimony, what the sequence of events are, all that stuff. Voting. Okay, deliberation, most cases deliberate in open session. Record must reflect the vote of each member and any member that did not vote. Decisions of Board of Appeals have to be memorialized in a written opinion that reflects the board's findings of fact and its legal conclusions. Board of Appeals are quasi-judicial, meaning that when they're appealed, decisions of boards of appeals are appealable to the circuit court of the county. So the factual findings on appeal are given great deference. In other words, the court will not generally question a Board of Appeals factual findings. Just like in a judicial system, the appellate courts don't question the factual findings of the trial courts. And the appeals are heard on the record. In other words, if a case is appealed from the Board of Appeals to the circuit court doesn't conduct a new trial. It doesn't take new evidence. It looks at the records of the Board of Appeals, gives deference to its factual conclusions, makes sure that it properly applied the law. If it did not properly apply the law, then it may overturn the decision of the Board of Appeals. No ex parte communications in Board of Appeals. What does that mean? So parties to a Board of Appeals proceedings should not have communications with members of the board without the other party present. The example I always give is you're on the Board of Appeals. You're sitting in your office at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. There's a Board of Appeals proceeding that night at 7. The applicant for a variance gives you a call in your office. The correct course of action in that instance is to say, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. I'll hear what you have to say tonight at our proceeding. Thank you very much. Hang up the phone. If that occurs, you have to put it on the record. So go on the record, you say, I'm sitting in my office at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The applicant gave me a call. He wanted to talk about his case. I immediately shut him down and said, no, I can't talk to you about this. We'll see you tonight at the Board of Appeals hearing, and then I hung up the phone. So just make sure you put it on the record. That make sense? Okay. All right, questions about that? That's all the law stuff.
I do have a couple questions. Go ahead.
There's a lot of like meeting up at 24 and talking about things coming up next night, and if you have more forum of the friend.
Yeah.
So you want to repeat that question? Because the audience,
yeah. So the question is, members of the Board of Appeals in a small town having coffee in the afternoon, talking about a case, frowned upon, should not be done. There's Open Meetings Act implications. If there's less than a quorum at that coffee shop, it's not a meeting of the Board of Appeals, so there's really no problem with it. If there is a quorum at that coffee shop, it's a meeting, meaning that the public is allowed to be there and watch what they do. But all Board of Appeals members should also take the Open Meetings Act training.
yes, and it is required to have at least one person there.
Yeah.
And again, it's not a good idea to do that in the first place. So don't go to the coffee shop with everyone else and talk about what's going to be on the agenda. If you meet them in the coffee shop, say hello, talk about the sports or whatever to avoid that.
Only talk about what's happening before the Board of Appeals at the Board of Appeals hearing.
Yeah. The other question we have, can the Planning Commission also act as a Board of Appeals in a non-charter county?
Can the planning commission also act as a board of appeals and I don't think so. No.
My general
heard that.
thought would be no, but a planning commission in a non-charter county and a municipality do occasionally or will actually need to act in a quasi judicial manner when they are approving certain things such
Yep.
as site plans. So you should be taking the factual, you won't necessarily adhere to the swearing of oath and other types of things, but you should be evaluating on the facts of the matter. You need to be mindful of not going out and visiting a site as again, the open meetings issues and a variety of things. If you're doing certain I'll call quasi judicial approvals of certain types of planning commission actions, subdivisions, or site plans where you want to avoid some of those things, and you really need to be factual in your deliberations, your decision making. So that's the only thing I could think of that you would kind of have that quasi judicial hat as a planning commission.
Yeah, the planning commission can't take the roles of the Board of Appeals, but the planning commission, as you say, does exercise in certain instances quasi judicial authority. Okay. Ethics. Okay, real quick. Public ethics laws. The point of public ethics laws are to prohibit improprieties by government officials and, almost as importantly, any appearances of improprieties by government officials. The purpose is to ensure fair dealings by people holding public office, right? So all the purpose of public ethics laws all go to this. Counties and municipalities must enact provisions related to conflicts of interest, financial disclosure, and lobbying, and they should be similar to the state ethics laws. So most counties and municipalities have adopted ethics laws that largely mirror the state ethics laws. Okay, officials, employees may not participate in a matter that has a direct financial impact on them or a member of their family, hold outside employment that could somehow impair their impartiality or the independence of their public judgment, use the prestige of their office for private gain, use confidential information acquired to benefit themselves in some meaningful way. Conflicts of interest, all prohibited. This next set of things, a public official can't do unless they've been given an exemption by the State Ethics Commission, hold or acquire an interest in a business that does business with their agency, be employed by a business that has or is negotiating a contract with the agency, represent any party for a contingency fee before any local body. Ethics Commission might permit these things, but will always require recusal of the public. It's like a disclosure thing. So I've got this interest. I'm disclosing it to the State Ethics Commission so they can have light on it, and then they can set the parameters that I have to follow to make sure that my conflict doesn't adversely affect the agency. Gifts, $20 for people you do business with. Post-employment, you can't be paid to represent another in connection with a specific matter in which the official participated substantially while employed by the agency. So you can't switch teams, essentially. Leave my government job where I have all this intimate knowledge about a particular project and then go work for the firm that's doing the project. Okay, so recusal. So it's always appropriate to recuse yourself when you discover some sort of conflict of interest in a matter. So for instance, a planning commissioner's spouse has a development project that is coming before the commission for site plan approval. So I'm sitting on the planning commission. My wife has an interest in this thing. I gotta disclose that and recuse myself and not participate in any way in the matter. it's not enough just to disclose it. You have to disclose and recuse. And what does recusal mean? Leave the room, right? You shouldn't even be in the room when there's a matter being considered that you've recused yourself from. Okay, great website. Lots of information on ethics laws on the State Ethics Commission website, including opinions, rules, all kinds of fun stuff. All right, we got questions.
Is the disclosure of the conflict mandatory? Do you think that it was
Question, go ahead and repeat it.
Oh, yeah, so is disclosure of a conflict always necessary? Because the supposition is perhaps disclosing the conflict may affect the hearing in some way. So if you're going to recuse yourself, you got to state a reason for recusing yourself, right? Yeah. So yeah, you got to disclose the conflict. So one, light of day. How that affects other members of the commission or the Board of Appeals or whatever, you know, if that for some reason creates a conflict for them, then maybe they have to consider that.
Yeah. And the other thing to think about is, again, you have to, it is assumed that you're going to be on a board to address 99% of the issues. And I'm not saying or not, but I have heard of folks kind of lamenting to me, this particular planning commissioner is recusing themselves all the time, and we don't have a quorum sometimes because they do it more often. So you just need to be mindful that if you're in a business that is, you're in an engineering firm and you're on the planning commission, and half of the cases that are coming to it are cases that your engineering firm is working on, you're recusing yourselves half the time. Maybe it's probably better that you aren't on the planning commission and actually just attend for your items and get someone else in those instances. So recusal, think about how it impacts the business of your planning commission or your board of appeals along the way.
Yep. Okay. Police power is, choose all that apply. Authority to regulate, to protect public health and safety. The basis for zoning and other land use regulations, ability to dissipate the speed limit with impunity, delegated by the state to counties and municipalities. All that apply. Yep.
That's what they say here.
Awesome. Development rights when construction is complete. Applicant wears a three-piece suit. Changes on the property are visibly discernible, thereby giving notice to the public. Public notice is printed in the local newspaper. C. A regulatory taking occurs when your lawyer says so. A use is not permitted under the current rules. A regulation removes all economic value in the property when it is determined that a variance is needed. See. An unconstitutional exaction occurs when there's no nexus between the exaction and the government purpose for the exaction. There's both a rational nexus and rough proportionality between the exaction and the government purpose. The band leader's brains are on the contract. A. Correct. Hearing before the Board of Appeals must be recorded, catered, have testimony taken under oath, include the recorded vote or failure to vote of each member, all the above, A, B, A, C, or D only, B only. F. Yes. Counties and municipalities must enact public official ethics rules for the following: lobbying, disclosure, financial disclosure, conflict of interest, all the above. Correct. Ex parte communication from a party to a Board of Appeals member should be encouraged, disclosed to all parties and summarized on the record, rewarded, kept secret from the public. B. That's all.
One last conflict.
Talk fast.
Paul, because Paul notoriously leaves.
I got to drive 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I agree. So he is going to be leaving. Are there any questions of Paul on law or ethics before he leaves? Either, Cannon?
Here we go. One more question for, can a municipal planning commission grant a variance, or does the law always go to the Board of Appeals? So that was a question. I think the
Board of
Board of
Appeals
Appeals.
gives variances.
Are site visits not allowed by planning commission members prior to deciding on a variance, site plan, or other matters?
Yeah, this is an Open Meetings Act question, really. It can be done in a way that does comply with the Open Meetings Act.
Yeah, I'll just give you my experience in Frederick City. We actually did this, and this was before they did a little bit of changes to the open meetings. We actually advertised that we were doing site visits on the Board of Appeals. We sent a notice to the local newspaper. We said, we are piling into the van at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and this is the sites that we're going to go to. And we will not talk, you're welcome to be in there, but they all knew that they weren't allowed to talk about the case, talk about it in the car or anything, but they could go to the site. We invited the applicant to be there. And so we would go through them, they would see the site, and they would be able to walk the site, but they weren't allowed, and they were instructed, not allowed to talk about the case or anything. You could look around, but don't ask any questions, but be prepared to ask those questions during the hearing. But that was the only way we ensured compliance of the open meetings and allowing for site visits for that. Otherwise, go on your own and stay off the property. All righty. Hold on, one more question. Is a jurisdiction list a salt mine as a conditional use and then requires an applicant to give the jurisdiction free salt in order to approve the use? Would that be an exaction issue?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. We're going to go on to Tracy Gordy is now going to start her portion. And thank you very much. And thanks, Paul, and safe drive.
Good. We're good.
You're good.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Tracy Gordy, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the comprehensive plan, which is generally agreed upon that the comprehensive plan is the backbone to any community planning process. It is the visioning document for a community, and it takes us from where we are to where we want to be, where we want to go. And I don't have the.
Tell Paul to take that.
He didn't take it.
Is this it?
Right here. No, we got it.
We got it.
Sorry.
Accusing Paul of stealing clickers. Come on, Chuck. He's a lawyer.
Sorry about that. So planning values. The overarching value that we look at when we're doing planning is that we're looking at the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. That is the overarching goal in every decision that we make. When we're looking at planning and regulatory development, we're looking at police power, like Paul mentioned. So when we're looking at exercising police power, we certainly need to be able to justify for the health, safety, and welfare of the individuals. But beyond that, planning values have expanded into resource conservation, not just resource conservation of our natural resources, but also our resource conservation of our fiscal responsibilities as well. And as we know, when we start to plan our environment, we want it to be well designed, we want it to be functioning, and we want it to be cost effective as well. And that's why we take such a strong look at sprawl development, and we look at things like we've talked about tonight, PFA and developing in PFAs. We want our process to be predictable. We want it to be consistent and fair. We want it to be transparent, obviously. And we really want to have public participation. In any community planning process, we should be looking at it being inclusive and fair. And again, the predictability on the part of the citizen that they know what to expect. They know that they're going to have a voice. They know when you're going to meet. They know what the responsibilities they have as citizens and what responsibilities you have as planning commissioners. We talk about these responsibilities with respect to the comprehensive plan specifically. Probably the single biggest task that the Planning Commission is given is the development of the draft comprehensive plan for the community. We're going to touch on that a little bit before we get into other duties and responsibilities. The process for which the comprehensive plan is developed is outlined in the land use article. Again, that's been talked about a lot. It's nice that these modules build off one another. So as a planning commissioner, you have a duty to prepare the comprehensive plan, and then the planning commission has the authority to recommend that plan to the local elected officials who actually adopt the plan. The 12 visions in the state of Maryland, this is the basis for what Maryland uses to develop their planning policy. And the 12 visions initially were 7 visions that were introduced in 1992 as part of the Smart Growth Act. And at that time, we had the visions and then we expanded upon them. And the visions now are 12 visions, which were adopted in 2009 by the Maryland General Assembly. One of the requirements for comprehensive planning is that the 12 visions be incorporated into your comprehensive plan. And when we say incorporated, we don't mean just incorporated, oh, we're going to list the 12 visions in our comp plan on page 2, and that's the beginning and end of it. What we like to see in your comprehensive planning document is that you've looked at these 12 visions and that you've incorporated them into your comp plan in some sort of meaningful way, either in your various elements of transportation, natural resources, land use, maybe in some of your policy statements or in some of your recommendations, or even in your implementation strategies. The comprehensive plan, as I mentioned, it is the backbone to the community. It is the visioning document. It looks at many, many things. It looks at existing conditions. It looks at the way your community has historically evolved. It looks at trends, at opportunities, but it also establishes your goals, your objectives, your recommendations, your strategies, which then serve as the basis later on for your implementation documents, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. The comprehensive plan, as it's developed, the process that you go through is a very rational process. So when you start to begin to look at either creating your comprehensive plan, updating your comprehensive plan, and it can take a variety of forms. You may just need to amend your existing plan slightly if your community hasn't changed a lot, or if you've had drastic changes or substantial changes, you might look to rewrite your comprehensive plan based upon that. So it can be a wide range of what you need to do in looking at your plan and your plan updates. It can be something as small amendments, it can be a small rewrite, or it can be a complete rewrite. As you start to do that, you take an inventory of your existing conditions and you start to analyze that inventory to determine what changes need to be made based on the changes that have occurred historically over whatever time frame that you're looking at. Once you do your analysis, then you start to make your recommendations for the strategies that you're going to implement the plan, the implementation ordinances. Some of those examples of implementation ordinances would be like your zoning ordinance, your subdivision regulations, critical area regulations, forest conservation regulations. All of those regulatory documents are supposed to be consistent with your comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan serves as the foundation or the basis for the development of those implementation ordinances. And of course, getting feedback from the public, and not just from the public, but also from different staff people, different agencies, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. The land use article, you've heard a lot about tonight. One of the good things about the land use article, in addition to many other things, is it provides the outline and the framework for your comprehensive plan. So it actually tells you what elements are to be included as in your comprehensive plan as required elements. I'm not going to read them, they're listed here, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. Water resources is a relatively new element that was created by House Bill 1141 in 2006. So that is a relatively new element, even though that seems like a long time ago. Municipal growth is an element that only applies to municipalities. Counties are not required to have a municipal growth element. And the municipal growth element is beneficial in that it shows future annexation areas for municipalities, which is a really good element to create a coordination effort between the county and the municipality. Mineral resources, even though it's a required element, the reason it says optional on there is because you're only required to include a mineral resources element if mineral resources is a viable economic activity in your community. If it's not, you're not required to include that. Some additional required elements are listed here. Again, fisheries has an asterisk because fisheries is only required if you have tidal waters in your community. If you don't have tidal waters, you're not required to have a fisheries element. It's important to mention the housing element. That's actually our newest element that has been added as a required element. And I will give a shout out to Joe. Joe's been instrumental in developing models and guidelines, which I'll touch on those a little bit later as well. We have a housing element on Maryland Department of Planning website now, models and guidelines for the housing element to help you develop that. The requirement is that any comprehensive plan that is updated after that magical date there of June 1, 2020 is supposed to include now a housing element as a required element. It was in fact optional before. And then we have optional elements. So you have the required elements that were on the last two frames, and now you have optional elements, which basically those elements are anything that's unique to your community that you feel should be included in your comprehensive plan, that it's necessary to address, it's necessary to establish goals and objectives and a framework for how you move forward. And that can run the gambit. There is no prescribed element that has to be included in this list. It can be anything that you feel is important to your specific community. Lately, we've seen a lot more development of hazard mitigation type elements because we've had so many storm events, and where we live in a coastal area, we've seen a lot more of that. But you could have economic development, you could have historic preservation, historic districts, anything that you think is important to your community that you feel needs to be included in your plan. So, comprehensive planning process. As planning commissioners, it is not an easy task, and I think that's widely recognized. It's not an easy task for a couple of reasons. One, the average time, I would say, and I've not been doing this as long as Chuck has, but I'm getting close. Here in our region, in the Lower Eastern Shore, a comprehensive plan update, if we're talking about looking at a comprehensive plan and looking at each section and trying to update and rewrite the sections that are relevant, not a total rewrite, just an update, it's usually a year-long process from start to finish. And that doesn't always include adoption. That's just the meetings that the Planning Commission has and the public input and everything that you go through. But beyond it being time consuming, in addition to that, it's not easy because you have so many different viewpoints in your community that you have to take into consideration, and you want to make sure that you're inclusive of all the different stakeholder groups and that you're considering that when you're putting together your draft plan. You can work to do your comprehensive plan update. You can do it any number of ways. You can work, if you're fortunate enough to have staff in your city or town or county, that's great. A lot of small towns don't have staff. So you're looking at any number of ways it could happen. It could happen with a hired consultant if you have the funds to do that. It can happen with an advisory committee that can be a mix of community members and can have other members like a planning commissioner representing as well. But there's many different ways in which you can put together your update process, and that's left up to the local jurisdiction on how they want to form their committee or their group to do that. In the comprehensive planning process, again, I mentioned about all the different viewpoints. That's really important. It's important to make sure that everybody in the community feels like they had an opportunity. That's the key, that they had an opportunity to have a say in your plan update. And that's important from the stakeholder viewpoint of, as mentioned here, business people, residents, landlords, advocacy groups, but it's also important from the individual standpoint. You want to make sure that every single person, if they so choose to be involved in the process, that they have the opportunity. And that's taking into account the fact, just a very simple example. If your planning commission meets at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, what is the likelihood that many of your citizens could attend that meeting? They can't, because many of them are working. So you have to think about those things, and then you have to present alternative opportunities. And it used to be like just the meetings were all that were offered. But now in today's time, we have all these other avenues. We have social media. So we see a lot of Facebook pages that can be created for a comp plan update, put them on your municipal or county website. You can do surveys. There's any number of ways that you can give people the opportunity to have input other than just attending a meeting, which isn't always conducive to public input. I should have finished that sentence, conducive to public input. I want to make a point about work sessions. You see the bulleted list here. At Planning Commission work sessions, they're so key and they're so important to the work that you have to do, because that's the point at which you're absorbing and taking in all of this information, the existing conditions, you're looking at any background studies, you're looking at existing documents that can help inform your decisions on the plan. You're looking at all of this information and you're trying to put together this draft document with the assistance of either staff or a consultant or advisory group. So what's important about work sessions is that typically, not always, and it certainly is a local decision, but typically work sessions are held in addition to your normal monthly planning commission meetings, because your normal monthly planning commission meetings may be eaten up with development proposals and other things that you're working on that don't leave the amount of time that you need to do the comp plan update. You hold a separate work session, and then typically, again, I'm not saying always, but typically work sessions are much different than public hearings. In public hearings, it's more formal and you give people an opportunity to comment. Work sessions is really more the exchange of information and putting together the document between the planning commission members and whoever the person or persons are that are helping them create the draft document. Typically, that's not the forum for public input. Or you can have a work session and have a small portion of it for public input, but not for public comment. Public work sessions, though, are always open to the public. So they can come in, they can view what you're doing, they can listen. It's an open, transparent process, but that might not be the forum where they give their personal input or their thoughts or ideas. Does that make sense? Coordination. So we talk about this because the comprehensive plan is a really good opportunity to utilize coordination among internal and external. So you have, let's talk at the county level now. At the county, you have a public works department, you have a planning department, you have maybe water and sewer, you have all these different departments that at this point of a comp plan update or rewrite, you have the opportunity to bring those people in internally and talk about different things that they feel need to be considered for the comprehensive plan. That's your internal coordination, not just with other internal agencies or departments, but also with staff of those departments. Then you have external coordination, where in this case, you may have coordination efforts that need to be designed between a municipality and a county, or from county to county. We have many instances where projects are proposed, like some of the projects here, like school planning or water resource planning, transportation planning. Those types of infrastructure projects don't always stop at a magical boundary between a city and a county, or a county and another county. So we're looking at this as an opportunity for this kind of coordination. Here on the Eastern Shore in Dorchester County, we have two sister cities. We have Secretary and East Newmarket, and they share a wastewater treatment plant. So obviously, when they're doing their comprehensive planning and their water and sewer planning, they need to coordinate, because everything that's going to be put in each of their respective plans has to consider the other. That's just one very small, minor scale example of some of the things that you need to think about when you're doing these comprehensive plans and any kind of coordination. Not just also coordination with county to county or municipality to county, but also state agency or federal agency to county or municipality if you have a shared resource that needs to be planned for, such as a state park. Then again, talking about interjurisdictional coordination, again, like I said, we use these comp plans as a tool for sharing this information. But also, when we talk about linkages with land use policy and regulatory permits, you may have a project that you need to coordinate the regulatory permits with another jurisdiction, or you may put in a grant application that's a joint grant application between a municipality and a county, two counties, again, using the wastewater treatment plant as an example, Secretary and East Newmarket. If they were going to upgrade the wastewater treatment plant, they would have to be able to coordinate with each other to do that, not only on the funding, but also on the permitting. Very small example, but just to show you how the interjurisdictional coordination is very important to think about as you move through your comprehensive planning process, to make sure you don't leave out those linkages. That could be, could be a big miss if you don't. Reviewing the comprehensive plan, whoops, went ahead of myself here. The Planning Commission, this is an important slide. It's important to note that the Planning Commission, as I mentioned, is assigned with the task of developing the draft comprehensive plan. When you get to the point as a planning commissioner, as a body where you have a comprehensive plan that's ready in draft to be submitted, you submit for 60-day review to the Maryland State Clearinghouse, which is housed in the Maryland Department of Planning. At that point, the Maryland Department of Planning State Clearinghouse will then send that draft comprehensive plan out to all the state agencies. And within that 60-day time frame, you will receive back comments from any agency that has any comments to make. I'm not going to promise you that you'll receive comments from every agency. You definitely will from the Maryland Department of Planning. But at that point, you have 60 days in which those comments you wait for those comments to be received. That is your comment review period. You can also open that period up to your community and to the general public to submit comments. Once you receive your comments, the Planning Commission meets again and starts to consider all these comments that have been fed in. As planning commissioners, it is your option whether you want to include all, some, or none of those comments. And you make that determination and take whatever period of time you need to do that to prepare your draft document prior to your public hearing. When you hold your public hearing, you're putting your draft document out there for the public to say, as a planning commission, this is what we are proposing for the town of whatever, and this is our draft document. At that point, at the public hearing, which is required under the land use article, you are required to take public comment. You should definitely manage public comment. You don't want to be there for 5 hours, obviously, but at the same time, you want to be fair and allow people to have adequate time to express their views or express their opinions on the draft document. Once you have had your public hearing, once again, you need to meet. You need to decide how much, if at all, you're going to incorporate the additional public comment that you received, and then your final draft document will be recommended to the elected officials for adoption. Again, the key word is recommended. You have recommending authority on this document that you have prepared. The elected officials have the authority to approve it. On the adoption by the council, public hearing is not required by the land use article for the initial review of this and adoption of it. It may be required in your local jurisdiction. It may be a local requirement, so you need to be aware of that. And sometimes it's the case where the chair and maybe a member or two of the Planning Commission will attend the elected officials meeting and may even give testimony on the comprehensive plan to the elected officials to explain the process they went through and maybe some key points, especially if you know there's going to be something in the comprehensive plan that could potentially be controversial. The elected officials then have the ability to either adopt the plan as submitted or modify the plan in some way. They also have the ability not to approve the plan, and there is a process outlined in law for what happens when elected officials drastically modify the plan and or don't approve the plan. And I won't go into that now just for the sake of time, but there is I will reference it verbally so people want to look it up. It was House Bill 919 in 2015. So that was House Bill 919 in 2015 that explains the process that occurs if a local elected body determines to either not approve the plan or substantially modify the plan. Okay. And it's important to note that the comprehensive plan is required to be reviewed every 10 years. You'll often hear, oh, we got to update the plan. It's been 10 years. The way that the law reads, it says review and if necessary, update. So if you have a community that has not undergone a great deal of change or activity over the last 10 years, and you review your document and for whatever reason, you don't feel that there's enough activity that has occurred to make any changes, you can simply, as a planning commission, draft a letter to the elected officials and say, we have reviewed the comprehensive plan and we feel there's not enough substantial change in the community to warrant an update at this time. And that can serve, if accepted by your elected officials, that can serve as your 10-year update. Now, we don't recommend that necessarily because like right now, we've got census data out. There seems to be always a need to do at least some minor amendments. But if it did happen that way, that would be a legit 10-year update, review and update. On comprehensive plan assistance, I mentioned before that the Maryland Department of Planning has developed guidance documents. They're technical assistance and guidance documents, and they're known as models and guidelines. We have models and guidelines on a variety of subjects. On some individual elements like water resources or municipal growth, like I just mentioned, the one that Joe was instrumental in, which was the housing element. If you have an interest in models and guidelines and you want to know what topics we have, or you're interested in gaining a copy, I would recommend to you here in the room and the people online that they contact their regional planner for their region, which in this case is Keith and I from Talbot County down, and we would see about getting you that. Some of the M&Gs are a little outdated, but many of them are still very useful, and we have that available to you. But more importantly, I think even than that, is that the Maryland Department of Planning has started a process in the last few years where if a jurisdiction is getting ready to undergo a comprehensive plan update, you can contact MDP or regional planner at MDP and let us know that. And we will contact our state sister agencies and we will do a coordinating meeting in your jurisdiction. And we will look at your existing plan and we will let you know if there's anything within your plan that we think is of state interest, that you might receive comments from us when you would send us your draft plan to review. So, you know, we kind of look at this as well. If we don't have a say in anything that you're doing, and it takes, like I said, a year to do your comprehensive plan, and then you submit it to the state, and then all of a sudden we hit you with all these comments that you're going to feel like, well, why didn't I know this at the beginning when we started this process and we could have considered that? This type of a technical assistance meeting would help us meet with you at the very beginning of your process and kind of put that stuff on the table up front so that you can consider it as you move along during your comprehensive plan review. So it's kind of a really good thing to start the process with, and we're available to do that. And if there's an interest on any jurisdiction's part, please reach out to us and we will be happy to arrange such a meeting.
Okay, we have two questions here. First one, in a small town, can we hire a consultant to work with our planning commission?
Absolutely. One of the things that regional planners like to do is like to be able to identify grant sources and find opportunities for funding, especially for comp plan updates. I'll be perfectly honest, it is not always easy, but I would say that on the lower shore, most of the comp plans that we have updated have been done through a grant funding source. And we have maybe 3 or 4 of those available. And I would highly recommend looking into that. Maybe whoever asked this question, talk with one of the regional planners and see if we can connect with the funding source to do that.
All right, another question. Are there ramifications if the comprehensive plan goes longer than 10 years before review?
No, there are not any ramifications at all. You know, the comprehensive plan is supposed to benefit the jurisdiction the most. So the ramification would be that you have an outdated plan and that you're behind on your vision for your community, which ultimately hurts the community. So no, there's no comp plan police that are going to come in to a jurisdiction and say, you know, bad jurisdiction, you're going to jail because you haven't updated your comp plan. And the state certainly isn't going to say that either. It's our role to try to help you do that update and accomplish it in any way we can, if that's your desire. But no, there's no penalty or ramification.
Okay, got a couple more here. Tracy, thank you. Can you tell us again who to contact about the M&G? And I guess there are multiple M&Gs.
Yes, I would say to reach out to your regional planner for your region. And if you don't know who that is, feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with that person, or it may be me.
And the models and guidelines are on our website.
Yep.
They're on the library. They're in the library at the bottom, and they're not intentionally hidden, but they're under archives. All of the old comprehensive M&Gs are in the archive section. All the newer versions are going to be an online module. So we are working on that. In fact,
we're updating the water resources
we're
element.
Updating the water resource element right now. And in fact, between now and the end of the year, we will be publishing a new version of that. Well, it includes climate change and some ethics, or I mean, some equity issues incorporated into that. So that's actually a first phase of a multi-phase effort to update that water resource element. It's one of the most complicated elements in the whole conference plan.
It is. Okay, are planning commission deliberations during drafting and review of comments subject to open meetings?
Yes, they are.
Okay, slide went by fast. What is the website? I'm not sure which slide that is, but let's go back. Maybe that one?
It probably is the maryland.planning.gov, I'm assuming. This particular one is the where the technical assistance, but you can actually look up MDP placing jobs, and you'll probably find that particular web page. And this also is a picture of our, we have a guidance on the updating process. We actually have a checklist for you to go through to actually evaluate whether or not you think your comprehensive plan needs to be updated or not. As Tracy said, smaller jurisdictions that don't really have a lot of growth going on may do this checklist and they say, well, our comp plan's still okay.
Yeah, the follow-up was MDP, so the MDP website, and that would be planning.maryland.gov. What you're seeing on the screen right now is just, those are just kind of image cutouts of existing models and guidelines. That's not like an actual web page. But your regional planner would be the best person to get in contact with. We do have a part of our web page that explains or lists the regional planner for every county.
And I do think it's important, and I don't know if I touched on this well enough to say that for smaller jurisdictions in particular, especially smaller rural jurisdictions, you may look at your comprehensive plan and you may say, okay, we do think we need to update the demographic data. We think that's important, especially with new census data out. But we've looked at everything else and we really don't think there's a need to do a major update. If that's the case, it's perfectly fine to do a comprehensive plan amendment. You can always do a comprehensive plan amendment. It is not set, a comprehensive plan is not set in stone. If something changes and the need arises to make that change in the comp plan, you can do a simple amendment and process that through 60 days. You don't have to do a complete rewrite or a major overhaul of your plan every single time that you review it. And you don't have to wait 10 years to do that either. If something significantly changes in 3 years after you adopt a plan, you can do an amendment and you can take care of that just through the amendment process. It's the same process. You still have to do the public hearing, you still do the review, all of that, but it's just not a complete overhaul. So that's just another option.
And sometimes you'll see certain elements, particularly the water resource element, carried over from one plan to the other because it is so complicated. So they'll update everything but that.
Okay, I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because I really do want to try to get you guys out as close to on time as possible.
And I have to go still.
Yes, and we have one more presenter. So we're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. You know, this speaks volumes. You're not alone. You are part of a team. As a planning commissioner, you are part of your body of your planning commissioners. But in addition to that, you have others to rely on. Your administration of your jurisdiction, other planning professionals. You have state agency folks like us that will provide technical assistance. So please know you're not alone, and certainly feel free to reach out to us for help. And roles and responsibilities of planning commission members, there's formal roles and informal roles. Like I mentioned earlier with the comprehensive plan, that's a significant duty and responsibility that you have to draft that plan, but then you do not have the ability to adopt it. You make a recommendation, you have an advisory role in that. So you do craft the comprehensive plan. Planning commission members also help to draft sometimes regulatory ordinances. They do not approve them. Again, you have the authority to make recommendations to the elected bodies, not just drafting ordinances and regulations, but also amendments to those as well. Text amendments to a zoning ordinance or a change to a subdivision regulation. And then also to create and apply the implementation tools and to implement the 12 visions that we talked about earlier. Also, these roles and responsibilities vary depending on the jurisdiction and depending on if you are a non-charter municipality versus a charter county. You'll notice here that again, we talk about the planning commissioner's role, and helping the community to achieve its vision. You're doing that through the comprehensive plan and the implementation of the comprehensive plan, seeking public input throughout the planning process, again, making sure that it's a transparent process and it's all inclusive. Doing the 60-day review, the Planning Commission is responsible for coordinating that, and then also for the 10-year review and if necessary update. So these are just a few of the roles of Planning Commission members. Advisory role for non-charter counties and municipalities. As I mentioned, you recommend approval to the elected officials for zoning ordinances, subdivision, and other development regulations, such as critical area or floodplain or forest conservation, any number of things. And also looking at capital expenditures needed to implement the comp plan, or projects or policies or programs mentioned in the comprehensive plan, and any other implementation tools. In this role, you do not have approving authority, you have an advisory authority with recommendations to the elected officials who ultimately adopt. For non-charter counties and municipalities, though, you do have approving role over the use of land for public uses, like parks, public streets, things of that nature, and then also the authority for the approval of subdivisions and site plans. In some cases, the authority for approval of subdivisions and site plans, it can be delegated to staff or an administrative officer. In most jurisdictions, minor subdivisions can be delegated in that way. Minor subdivisions don't always go to the Planning Commission. It would be major subdivisions and major developments and site plans. Also, things such as building permits. Building permits don't typically go to the Planning Commission. That's usually handled in-house by staff. For charter counties, it differs because charter counties, it depends, their roles depend on what's included in their county charter. And so that can differ from charter county to charter county, but it definitely differs. The roles differ from non-charter counties, municipalities, and charter counties. Again, I touched on this a little bit and just want to reiterate the difference. It's important to take away tonight the difference between work sessions and public hearings. Work sessions are much different and held differently than public hearings. Public hearings are required to be advertised. People are permitted to speak. You can set rules for public hearings, but you have to have the opportunity for public input, whereas work sessions are not held that same way. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's very, very good to have rules of procedure for your Planning Commission and Board of Appeals. Not every jurisdiction has that, and that is something that you can develop, and it would be good to develop. It's not required, but it's very helpful. And if samples of those kinds of things are needed, Maryland Department of Planning can provide samples of those for Planning Commission and Board of Appeals. Plan review. The reason we put this slide in and included it is because as Planning Commission members, it's very important to try to have a good understanding of the types of development proposals that you're going to be reviewing. And that may mean that you need to become very familiar with your zoning code and your subdivision regulations, because otherwise you're really not going to understand what you're looking at and what you should be reviewing and what you should be recommending. It's fine to rely on staff, but many small jurisdictions don't have staff. And that is not to say that staff isn't infallible either. So it's very, very good to know and be familiar with your implementation ordinances that apply to some of the development proposals that you'll be looking at. But even in addition to that, it should be mentioned that it would be very helpful to the Planning Commission if materials were given to the Planning Commission in advance of the meeting. If you're coming in as a Planning Commission member and you're being given a packet as you sit at the table, there is no way that you're going to be able to have the proper input on that development proposal if you haven't had an opportunity to review that ahead of time. If you get the materials ahead of time and you have questions, there is nothing wrong with you inquiring of staff questions that you may have ahead of time to clarify what you need to know for the night of the meeting. It's just helpful all the way around. It's helpful to staff and it's helpful to planning commissions, but most importantly, it's helpful to the applicant. I mean, the applicant needs for you to be informed and the applicant needs for you to be aware. And if everybody's educated on what they're going to be reviewing that night, it just makes for a much smoother process all the way around. This is actually my last slide, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on this, except to say that this was a bill that was passed a few years ago, and the actual name of it is the Sustainable Growth and Agricultural Preservation Act of 2012. That act allowed for jurisdictions to establish growth tiers. And those growth tiers, they range from tier 1 to tier 4. And those growth tiers made determinations, or local jurisdictions made determinations about what residential areas would be served by public sewer versus on-site septic systems. It was not required that you adopt growth tiers. If you did not adopt growth tiers, that was your option, but there were repercussions to that in that you were not allowed to have any major developments on septic any longer in your jurisdiction. The reason why this slide is included in here, because we could talk a long time about, it's called the septics law. You know, that's what we call it informally. The reason why I included this in here is because as planning commission members, you may or may not have had a role in the adoption of these tiers. I can speak for the lower shore that in every jurisdiction that we did that helped jurisdictions with the growth tiers, every single growth tier map did go before the planning commission. So sometimes you can find an ordinance or a regulation or a law that's been passed where you're reviewing something that isn't your typical requirement. It's not your zoning code, and it's not your subdivision regulations. It could be something like this with the septics law, or it could be a critical area ordinance, which many planning commissions review. Could be a historic district ordinance. It could be anything. So in this case, we put it in here because the planning commission is required. If a jurisdiction adopted a tier map, planning commission is required to review any major subdivisions in the tier 3 areas and hold a public hearing and evaluate the cost of providing services to that major subdivision on septic and make a recommendation on that approval. Okay, ready for questions?
We have two more, unless there's some in this room. Can a town or municipality change all aspects of their comprehensive plan? Sorry. All right, let me try it again with my microphone on. Can a town or municipality change all aspects of their comprehensive plan if they have new elected officials and planning board members?
They can rewrite their comprehensive plan. They can rewrite their comprehensive plan any way they so desire.
I would agree with that. I'd also say, but you'd want to think about that. I mean, a comprehensive plan by definition is a long range plan, and you know, changing it just because of a massive political change on a whim is just something you want to think about, because you know, a lot of people might have invested in your community or looking towards the plan, and you know.
Yeah, I guess I didn't interpret the question right. I wasn't thinking they were changing it just because they had new elected officials. That wouldn't be the cause for it. It would be because you're headed in a different direction, or you have a new vision, or there's been substantial changes that need to be addressed.
Yep, good point. It's hard to tell by the question exactly. All right, and the last question, can you elaborate a little more on the new housing element?
I'll let you do that, Joe.
I read that one and I figured that would be me. Sure. So the housing element, it went into effect of June 1st, 2020. I guess you could almost better define it as an affordable housing element, at least the way it's written. It says that and this is for charter, non-charter, and municipalities, it says that the housing element shall address the need for affordable housing. I'm not gonna get the language right, but affordable housing for low income and workforce households based on HUD's, the Housing Urban Development's area median income definitions. So they define it as low income as affordable housing for those at 60% of area median income, and workforce housing is a lot of flexibility. It's 60 to 120% AMI for home ownership, 50 to 120% AMI for renters, and then it's even modified if it's in a Maryland Department of Housing Community Development's Maryland Mortgage Program area. So essentially, AMI you'll commonly see this used by HUD and DHCD for how they decide where to fund housing project, that put funds towards housing, HOPE and other similar type funds. And it tends to be regional in a lot of places unless it's a rural county. So like DC area and all the surrounding counties share an AMI, and then more rural places, I can't remember all the ones down here where they are. I think there's a larger Wacomico one that goes, I think, even into Delaware, maybe even down into Virginia. I can't remember. I think Worcester has its own. And they update AMI every year. So essentially, the plan or the requirement is that you plan to have housing that's affordable for low-income individuals based on that AMI, and workforce, what they call workforce housing. So it's kind of, you know, in that moderate range. So teachers, government workers. And we have a lot of resources on our housing element to help you with that, give you potential strategies, goals, and objectives.
I think it's under our work tab on our website.
Yes, it's under our work tab.
Yeah,
And
you go to MDP's website and you go to the tab Our Work. It's right on the front page.
yeah, and there will be a change to that in 2023 that we're still trying to figure out, called the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement. That will be a requirement and housing elements starting in 2023. But look for more information on that.
Okay, so the giveaway here is what? Comprehensive plans a reflection of a community's vision for the future, community evolution, conditions and trends, goals, objectives, policies to visualize the vision, or all of the above. Right, all of the above. The number of planning visions to be addressed in a comprehensive plan is 12, correct? The comprehensive plan process should involve, yes, all the above. A comprehensive plan is required to be reviewed every 10 years. True. I was going to say true or false, true, yes. And any questions that you have for me? Thank you all.
One question, you want to start it off?
Oh, what's the question?
I'll read the question. And
I
Chuck,
have 5 minutes to get my whole section done that normally is supposed to be at least a half
well,
hour.
they said briefly. So briefly discuss how the local government, for us, a town council and planning commission, interact on developing the comp plan. Briefly.
Here's a recommendation from doing this for 30 years now. I recommend a planning commission work closely with their elected body. Some jurisdictions, such as Howard County, will actually develop what they call guidelines for the process before they actually have their preparation of the comp plans, addressing basically a work plan of things that they want to be addressed in their comprehensive plan update. That enables a communication between a planning commission and the elected officials. I would recommend that the planning commission have every other month meetings with their elected officials in a work session so they could talk about what they found out, what they're investigating, what issues that the planning commission are addressing, and then you can get feedback from the elected officials on what they would like you to address and consider in that process. So what you don't want to have is, and Tracy pointed this out, planning commission spends a year working on a comprehensive plan. They put their love, their life, everything into it. They go through this 60-day review, they change it, they address all that, and they recommend it to the elected official. Well, guess what? Law was changed back in 2015 that said in municipalities, this was true in non-charters, but way before that, but municipalities and non-charters, it goes to the elected officials. Well, guess what? All they have to do is hold a public hearing, and they could change everything that you'd spent a year doing, and they don't have to send it back to you. Or they can take a huge section and they say, we don't like this, we're getting rid of this, and we're changing it and putting in 2 words and doing it. Or they're going to change it the other way and put a whole new section in it, and they could do that. The law allows them as a body, as long as they hold a public hearing, they don't have to come back to you as a planning commission. You don't want that. You want the planning commission to be a partner with the elected officials because they ultimately have decision-making authority over the whole thing. So that integration of that conversation needs to be continuous all the way through the process, or you don't want, because you don't want to have a surprise at the end. Okay, I got to go. I got 3 minutes to do this whole thing. I'm not going to be able to do it in 3 minutes, but unfortunately, I've been put in this position many a times, and so I'm very fast, and you will probably not catch half of this, and I'm sorry about that, but I will try to do my best. So my job is to tell you about all of the tools that are used in adopting or to implement the comprehensive plan. And guess what? There's a lot of them. The number one is zoning. We talked about that countless times again. So you already know about this. It's a map and it's text. Zoning covers the density, the height, the bulk. Those are the things. But you control that and you implement your comprehensive plan. That's what really makes your comprehensive plan implemented most likely. Zoning's typical. This is a traditional, what's called Euclidean zoning. And you map your whole county, or your whole city in these different colors, and you go through that process. So that's the typical process of covering the whole jurisdiction in one of these different categories. Euclidean, some of the zones may be mixed use zones. That's a more approach, right? And guess what? It's not really new. Frederick, downtown Frederick, before there was zoning, there was mixed use. There was retail on the bottom floor, residential above. It works great. And guess what? We had to reinvent it back in the 1990s. So there are also, zoning has overlays, depending upon the situation where you have environmental concern, historic preservation, some type of scenic area that you're concerned about, water access, whatever, you actually may have an additional overlay. It may not change the underlying uses of the property. It may restrict a few. It may add a few, maybe not, but it certainly addresses certain things, may add a different process. Historic preservation usually has a process that involves a historic commission along the way. Some type of that along the environment may have certain types of construction or design standards that you would incorporate along that, that process. Zoning includes typically your regulatory plans. You can have performance plans. Have what's called performance zoning provisions in there. Things like traffic impact studies, impervious surface standards, etc. And then there's a lot of different ways of dealing with the land uses in a zoning ordinance. So zoning ordinances can get real complex real soon, or they can be simple. It depends upon your jurisdiction. Zoning ordinances don't change quickly. People don't like change when you're messing around with a property. Usually it is incremental. You add a little piece here, you take a little piece away there along the way. You can't do a wholesale change. Trust me, I've tried it and I've gotten the scars to prove that that's not a good idea. So you usually do it in slow process that usually involves a lot of input from stakeholders and property owners. Subdivision is the second phase or second most important implementation of comprehensive plans. Subdivision is a division of land into one or more parcels. Often may involve the dedication of right-of-way or the division of into lots for purposes of sales. So sometimes you may actually consolidate a few large parcels together, and that's part of the subdivision process as well. Typically, subdivision regulations include standards for how wide the road has to be, includes information about the improvement quality of that road. Does it have to have a curb, a gutter, some type of street trees, street lights? All of those kind of design standards are built into your subdivision regulation or development standards. Typically also include areas for utilities, may include landscaping standards, and then there's specifications on how do you actually record the document. In other words, is it going to be a Mylar, or is there going to be some kind of electronic submission of that document? So you go in this specification, that is usually part of your subdivision regulations. Now, you could have a unified development code that includes zoning, subdivision, forest conservation, all of those things together if you want, but they're all usually adopted by ordinance or amended through an ordinance process. The third most effective and impactful implementation of a comprehensive plan is the water and sewer plan. Water and sewer plans are done by the county, but they typically will have, or must almost invariably will have, municipal water and sewer plans that are owned by the municipality in the county's water and sewer plan, and you usually at the municipal level will submit amendments to the county's water and sewer plan. This addresses the phasing and usually the build out capacity improvements to your facility. It's got to be done every 3 years in that process. It's
supposed to be done every 3 years. I'll say it. It's supposed to be done every 3 years. There are a few jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions won't be named here, although if you come to me later on, I'll tell you who they are. They haven't amended their, updated their plan in totality. They do amendments, but they haven't updated their plan, and we wish they would. So the water and sewer plan really talks about those land use regulatory processes you have to go through. It will list a whole list of capital improvements. It typically lists the new water towers, the new wastewater treatment plants, the new extensions, et cetera. So usually it's a map, and it's also a lot of tables of information along the way. And they doing those updates, they usually, again, go back to the comprehensive plan. They look at the growth areas, they phase it in over time. It's really needed to be closely looked at, and that update process with your comprehensive plan for your projected future housing units and in future employment areas. One of the things, being for Frederick, if you'd heard from us a while back, we had a water moratorium 20 years ago, and we were growing so fast, we didn't plan for allocation of water. In fact, we didn't allocate water. We were just, signing off on subdivision plans and site plans and all that stuff. And we had all this water we thought we had over there. Well, lo and behold, MDE told us, well, you have a water treatment plant over there that goes on the Monocacy. That Monocacy can dry up. And so that water plant of 3 million gallons really doesn't count towards your capacity. And so we were freaking out at that particular point. But had we really actually done some of our own homework, and MDE wasn't wrong. I said a lot of nasty words to them when I was there, but they were right. And we got our ship in the order, in order, and we allocated and we tracked every drop of water from that point forward. And they have actually a good system in place. But if you actually keep a track of that and then you project forward, you can actually have a very well-coordinated water and sewer plan to your comprehensive plan through that process. Another regulatory tool in your toolbox for growth management is an adequate public facilities ordinance. Adequate public facility ordinances typically deal with schools, number one, roads, number two, and then they may deal with water, sewer. I've seen them for police, fire, even libraries. Now, 13 counties and 23 municipalities have adopted them. If you adopt an APFO, adequate public facility ordinance, you are required to report on it on an every other year basis, whether or not there's impediments. An APFO, what it does is it says, are the facilities adequate for your approval of this next development? And depending upon when you check it, sometimes you approve it at the subdivision stage, a preliminary. Sometimes you approve it at the site plan stage. So depending upon your ordinance of when you approve development and test it against your adequate public facilities ordinance, you may actually have a backlog that you have to factor in of all these previous approvals for this next approval. So it can get complicated real fast, but you often will address it, particularly if you've got PTAs and other ones that are really upset. The fact is that they're overcrowded schools. So APFOs are a tool to kind of control, manage the growth in your areas. So any jurisdiction can adopt an APFO. Often there are developer approvals that are often development rights and agreements approvals that are associated with allocations of school seats along the way. It really has to be, a reasonable tool. You can't use an APFO as a moratorium. If you do that, I'll guarantee you someone challenges in court and at one point says, well, we have an APFO for the next, we have a moratorium for 20 years. That's not going to work. It's got to be an expectation that you're working on putting the capital infrastructure in place to address that inadequacy in your facilities, to remove that stop. And so it really has to be tied with your capital improvements program. As I mentioned, 2-year reporting requirement. You submit a report on any impediments.
We publish that report and we submit it to the General Assembly so that they can get a sense of how are APFOs impacting development approvals in the jurisdictions that have adopted them. Okay, growth management tools, next round. Capital improvements program, as I mentioned before, capital improvements address APFOs or adequate public facilities. Capital improvements are your investment in your community, your future roads, your water and sewer plans, your schools, your variety of things. So it includes these kinds of sources: general funds. If you're a large jurisdiction, you have community development block grant programs. POS funding is mostly state funding, but there is an allocation to the counties, and it can go down to the municipalities. So these are the typical sources of funds that are available, usually in a capital improvements plan. The planning commissions are usually asked to review the capital improvement plan and supposed to determine whether or not it's consistent with the comprehensive plan through your capital improvements process as it's adopted by the legislative body for the budgetary process. Again, this process that's laid out in the CIP is typical, just like Tracy pointed out with the typical comprehensive plan. It's methodical, it's a logical process. Municipalities have the ability to annex. The process that you typically do is an annexation and expands the boundary. As mentioned before, the municipal growth element is where you identify future annexations. The annexation process for municipalities requires you to be contiguous. Go figure, you can't be in another jurisdiction already. You can't create an enclave. Now, the state of Maryland does not define what an enclave is. I could tell you what therefore, you may think it is an enclave, but if there's a 3-foot strip of land that isn't annexed and it's an umbilical cord out to the county, you've not created an enclave. So the state of Maryland has not had any court decision that defined an enclave. There are other states that have defined it, but so I have seen railroads, an abandoned railroad be the connection from an unincorporated piece of property completely surrounded by the municipality out to the rest of the county. And technically that's not an enclave, but as long as it's not fully surrounded with 100% enclosed, it may not be an enclave. And there's a process that you have to go through that's in the local government article on the annexations, requiring property owners to sign off and that. It ain't easy, and it typically requires, there's no surprise about this in annexation, is that an annexation is essentially double taxation. I'm Frederick City, so I'm getting taxes from Frederick City and the county, so I know double taxation, and it's a whopper. You got to really want to be in a municipality to be annexed. And the reason why you get annexed, you then are able to, your county may not be able to, or may not be agreeing to the zoning, and the municipality may. You may want water and sewer, and the only place that are going to provide that water and sewer are the municipality. They may require that as part of that annexation process. So there are reasons why a property owner wants to get annexed, but it's usually a mutually beneficial arrangement. Rules of the development newly annexed. You can actually prohibit certain uses in your annexation adoption ordinance. So again, that's part of that negotiation. A municipality does not have to annex a property. Property owner comes and says, I want you to annex me. You don't have to do that. You could say, my neighborhoods around here don't want you. Well, what if I do this? So this is one of the few times, and I don't have Paul here, but this is actually one of the few times you can actually have a contract zoning arrangement. You can restrict the actual uses on a piece of property so that, and what's really cool about it is it goes with the land. So any future owner can't necessarily say, but the zoning ordinance allows me that. You have an annexation that essentially put a deed restriction on those piece of properties when you annex the property. So there is one of the few times and the circumstances like that. Okay, Development rights and responsibility is an agreement. This is like contract arrangements. It's a quid pro quo. So if I'm going to get this municipal, this PUD, this planned unit development here, I agree as a developer to give you a school site, a library site, and I'll extend this road out here and improve it to your quality of this. In exchange, I want you to freeze those regulations for at least 5 years. And some jurisdictions have extended beyond 5 years. And what the purpose of that is, it gives a sense of predictability to the developer to allow them to invest in the property, put the infrastructure in place to start to develop the piece of property, knowing that the rules of the game aren't going to change midstream. So this is a provision that was passed in the legislation back in 1995. It allows for this negotiated arrangement between a private property owner and the local government for beneficial uses along the way. And that beneficial use is subject to interpretation along the way. But it can be valid at least 5 years unless extended. And I've also seen them actually given up to 20 years. Ouch. Because then people say, wait a second, talk about when they change the elected officials, people then start coming there, wait a second here, I didn't, and actually use that as a reason for running for office. We have lots of tools on our website, and I encourage you to go to that site, but there are other great tools out there. MML and Mako have really good resources on their website. We also, we do a lot of webinars and education through our Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. So you're most welcome to actually participate in any of those. All that stuff is available for free. We have test here. Zoning Maryland can change through a comprehensive process. Subdivision should be proposed location of all the above. According to state law, the county water and sewer plan should be kept current. B, every 3 years. Include the funding of capital improvements include the following. All the above. There we go. Unless amended or extended and locally approved, how long is the development rights and responsibility again? B, 5 years. Which of the annexation is true about newly annexed areas? All the above. And in closing, you will get a certificate. I will send you the PowerPoint presentation, so you get that. I will send you all the people online. I have you. I know you. I know who you are. I know your website. Please make sure whoever was here that you check marked so that I know you are going to, so I can get you on my list. We will send you a personally signed email from me sending you the PowerPoint and information about the event. And I want to thank you for your participation here. Tracy and did a great job coordinating this, and I want to thank Salisbury University. Your certificate will be taking a little bit longer because they got to get the signature from everyone and send it out to you. We will send that electronically to you. If you need a paper version printed and you don't have a color, you need to email us back. Cassandra will prepare a paper version and we'll mail it out to you. We will also, for those that are planning commission members and board of appeals members that you've told us that, we will put you on our list of members so that it's acknowledged that you have met your requirement for your education and all of those people that want to know about that stuff. Yeah, Tracy. Okay, you're all checked in, good. And again, I want to thank you all. Are there any last minute questions on there? I am 15 minutes over, but that's still pretty good.
There was a question earlier that I didn't have a chance to answer from the actual people in here logistically that you didn't have to, if you're online, you don't have to sign in because we have like the timestamps of when everybody signed
Yeah,
in. So that's for the people online right now.
Yeah, we know the people that are online, how long they have been
Yeah,
online.
we know who's been on and we know how long you've been on.
Yeah,
So
we know how long you're on, and if you're on for
there's one
extended
question
period,
about,
we'll keep you there.
do you want to answer a TMDL question?
Sure,
Okay.
I'll try.
It is my understanding that the EPA has put new limits on counties when it comes to the TMDL. This could limit or stop all new growth, sewage treatment plants, and septics. Can you touch on this as to how to consider this for comp plan updates?
We are actually addressing the TMDL issue because the TMDL is total
Maximum daily load. Total maximum
daily load. And the water resource element, when it was initially put on the books back in 2006, TMDL was not a regulatory requirement at the time. So the actual water resource element models and guidelines that is currently on the books doesn't address TMDLs. We are in the new version that's going to be coming out in end of December. Will start to address the TMDL requirement. So the answer is it depends. It depends upon what TMDL for whether it be the county or a particular watershed may impact development. This is why MDE has been working and the Bay Restoration Fund has been working with jurisdictions to get their wastewater treatment plants upgraded to ENR levels so that you could potentially recapture some of that nutrient load from your wastewater treatment plant for new development. So you may have had a TMDL that established a certain level. By virtue of you putting in a new wastewater treatment plant in place, you actually may be able to put more development. Additionally, one of the things that we are seeing is certain jurisdictions are actually choosing to extend their sewage treatment plants to areas that were formerly on septic and bringing them in, and they can actually get a credit on their TMDL, their load from that area on septic, and when it goes into a nutrient ENR plant. And what's interesting, it's a 10-to-1. So for every one housing unit I put on an ENR treatment plant, I can actually now add 9 more units that and still be equivalent in my loading. So if you take off of your septic and you put it on an ENR plant, you actually can have more development through that. So on the ENR plant. So the TMDL is changing the dynamic of a water resource element, and that's why we're really strongly encouraging counties to work with us to update their water resource elements. Okay. Again, thank you so much. Have a safe trip home. I guarantee you're probably not driving 3 hours like I am, so you'll be home before I will. And so, again, thanks a lot for everyone online. Stay safe and look forward to our emails. So good night, folks.
It's just. Remember how I do that real quickly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.